The stagecoach rolled into Pine Ridge on a Tuesday morning in late October, and the town barely looked up. That was the thing about Pine Ridge. It had seen enough arrivals to stop being impressed by them. Miners who came in flush with ambition and left 6 months later owing money to 3 different men, cattle drovers who blew through like weather, the occasional preacher, the occasional con artist. By 1883, the people of Pine Ridge had developed a particular talent for sizing up a stranger before they'd even stepped down from the coach, and they almost never had to revise their first impression. Clara Hawthorne stepped down from the coach and revised every expectation anyone in Pine Ridge had ever held about what a woman coming to be married ought to look like. She was tall, impossibly tall, some of them would say later, though that was the kind of exaggeration that happens when a person unsettles you and you need to make the unsettlement make sense. She was 5 feet 11 inches in her boots. She'd measured more than once in the way that people measure themselves when the world keeps making a point of their dimensions. She had wide shoulders and large hands, and the kind of posture that came not from confidence but from years of forcing herself not to apologize for the space she took up. Her hair was dark brown and pinned back efficiently, not prettily. Her traveling dress was the deep blue-gray of a lake in autumn, and it fit her exactly right because she had made it herself. She carried a large leather trunk and a smaller bag, and she set them both down on the packed dirt of the main street, and she looked around at Pine Ridge with the careful, cataloging expression of a woman who had long since learned that hope was a thing you kept private. The town looked back at her. There were maybe 15 or 20 people out on the street. It was a market morning, and the general store had a delivery in, and they all registered her arrival with varying degrees of openly expressed curiosity. A woman near the dry goods stand leaned to say something to her neighbor. 2 men outside the farrier's shop stopped talking and just watched. A boy of about 9 stared with the unapologetic blankness that only children can manage. Clara had traveled 840 miles from Chicago. She had spent 11 days on trains and then 2 days on the stagecoach, and she had eaten badly and slept worse, and she had not, in all that time, allowed herself to be afraid. She had allowed herself to be uncertain. That was honest. But fear was a different animal, and she'd kept it in a box. She looked down the street for the man she was supposed to marry. His name was Gerald Pitts. He was 42 years old. He ran a hardware store. He had written to her for 7 months, careful letters, not flowery, but steady and specific. He'd described his store, his house, the view from his back window. He'd asked about her work, her life in Chicago, the neighborhood she lived in. He had never, in 7 months of correspondence, asked her for a photograph or mentioned anything about what he expected her to look like. Clara had taken that as a good sign. She had been, she understood now, somewhat naive. Gerald Pitts was standing in front of his hardware store. She knew him immediately. The letters had included a physical description, average height, brown hair going gray at the temples, a habit of standing with his arms crossed that he'd mentioned himself, somewhat ruefully, as something his mother had always criticized him for. He was standing that way now, arms crossed, watching the stagecoach, watching her. Clara picked up her trunk and her bag and walked toward him. Later she would think about those 30 yards of Main Street. She would think about how the day was bright and cold, and that the mountains behind the town were extraordinary, white-capped and enormous, against a sky so blue it looked like something in a painting. She would think about how her boots made a solid sound on the street, and how she held her chin level, and how she was, despite everything, genuinely glad to have arrived. She walked the 30 yards, and she stopped in front of Gerald Pitts, and she said, "Mr. Pitts, I'm Clara Hawthorne. It's very good to finally meet you in person." He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at her the way a man looks at a bill he's received that is substantially higher than he expected. A quick look up and down, a recalibration, a very visible process of arriving at a conclusion. Then he uncrossed his arms and crossed them again. "You're taller than I expected," he said. Clara had been told this before, many times. She had responses for it, light ones even, if the situation called for it. "I've been this height for 20 years, she said. "It travels well." Nobody laughed. The people nearby were listening openly now. There was no pretense of minding other business. Gerald Pitts looked at her for another moment, and then he said, "I don't think this is going to work." Clara heard the words. She processed them. She said, "I beg your pardon?" "I said I don't think this is going to work." He wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. He was matter-of-fact, the way a man is matter-of-fact when he is certain he is in the right. I wasn't expecting, the letters didn't mention, "You're a great deal larger than what I had in mind." "Larger," Clara repeated. "I meant no offense." "You're rejecting me," Clara said, "on the street, in front of everyone." "I'm being honest with you, better now than later." "You're rejecting me," Clara said again, because she needed to hear the words in her own voice, needed to confirm the reality of what was happening. "On the street, in public, without a single minute's conversation, because I am tall." Gerald Pitts shifted his weight. For a moment, something that might have been shame moved across his face, but it passed quickly. "I just don't think we're suited," he said. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Inconvenience? Clara stood very still. She was aware of every person watching. She was aware of the boy of 9 still staring. She was aware of the woman from the dry goods stand who had come a few steps closer and was making no effort to look away. She was aware that she was 38 years old and had packed her whole life into a trunk and traveled 11 days to be standing on this street, and that the man in front of her had just described that journey as an inconvenience. She could feel the thing rising in her. Not tears, she was not going to cry, not here, but a kind of heat. The particular heat of a humiliation so clean and total that it almost had a shape. She set her trunk down. She looked at Gerald Pitts for a long moment. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Pitts," she said. Her voice was very even. "I'll manage from here." She picked up her trunk and her bag and she turned and walked back down the street. And the town of Pine Ridge watched her go, and nobody said a word. Clara walked to the end of Main Street before she let herself stop moving. There was a bench outside a building that turned out to be the post office. She sat on the bench and set the trunk in front of her and the bag beside her, and she put her hands in her lap, and she sat there for a while, very still, letting the town do whatever it was going to do around her. She had $12.40. She had a return ticket, technically. The agency in Chicago had included one as a formality, good for 30 days. She had the clothes in her trunk, her sewing kit, which was extensive and professional, and a small leather notebook in which she kept measurements and sketches. She also had nowhere to go. The return ticket was theoretical. $12.40 would get her as far as the nearest train hub, maybe if she didn't eat. And then what? Chicago? The apartment she'd let go of? The sewing work she'd given up, distributed to other women in her building because she'd been so certain she wouldn't need it anymore? She sat on the bench and she did the arithmetic, and she already knew the answer before she was finished. She couldn't go back. Not on $12.40, not within 30 days. Possibly not at all, depending on what she could manage here. A woman came out of the post office and stopped when she saw Clara. She was perhaps 50, compact and quick-looking, with gray-streaked hair and the kind of face that had settled into its lines and made peace with them. She looked at Clara, and then she said, without any particular ceremony, "You're the woman Pitts just turned away." "I am," Clara said. The woman made a sound. It was not quite a word. It communicated something, though. Not quite sympathy, but something adjacent to it. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" "Not yet. There's a boarding house, 2 streets over, the yellow building. Mrs. Halliday runs it. She's reasonable." She paused. "She'll charge you $4 a week. Meals included." "Thank you," Clara said. The woman nodded and went on her way. Clara sat a few more minutes on the bench, watching Pine Ridge move around her. A wagon came through. A dog crossed the street with a purposeful expression. 2 women emerged from the general store with parcels, talking, and one of them glanced at Clara and looked away quickly. Clara thought about Chicago. She thought about her workroom there, the good northern light through the window, the way the fabric smelled when you pressed it with a hot iron. She thought about her neighbor Mrs. Krebs, who was 70 and still sharp as a tack, and who had said to her when she told her she was leaving, "You're brave, Clara. I hope he's worth it." He wasn't, as it turned out. But the mountain behind the town was extraordinary. She kept coming back to that. It sat there at the end of the street like something enormous and indifferent and permanent, white against blue, and there was something about it that she couldn't quite name. Not comfort exactly, but something in the same territory. She stood up, lifted her trunk, and went to find the yellow building. Mrs. Halliday was a large woman in her 60s, who took Clara's $4 with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped seeing new arrivals as anything other than a transaction. She showed Clara to a room on the second floor, narrow, with a single window and a bed that was clean if not comfortable, and told her breakfast was at 7, supper at 6, and she'd expect the room kept tidy. "How long will you be staying?" Mrs. Halliday asked. "I don't know yet," Clara said. Mrs. Halliday looked at her for a moment with an expression that suggested she had heard this before and knew what it usually meant. "2 weeks minimum if you want the room," she said. $8. In advance. Clara had $12.40. She paid the $8. She had $4.40. She sat on the narrow bed in the narrow room, and she let herself be still for a while. The window looked out onto a side alley, and beyond that a slice of a backyard where someone had left a washboard leaning against a fence. The mountains were not visible from this angle. She opened her trunk and went through it methodically. Her sewing kit occupied a full quarter of the space. Needles, threads in 20-odd colors, measuring tape, thimbles, shears, a small pressing cloth, pins in their cushion. 3 reference books on construction and pattern making, a folded packet of letters, which she did not look at. The clothes were good. She'd made them all herself. That was the advantage of being a seamstress. You always looked better dressed than you were. She had practical clothes and 2 better dresses and the blue-gray traveling dress. She took out the sewing kit and the reference books and arranged them on the narrow dresser. Then she lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about what came next. The next morning, she walked the town. She did it systematically, the way she did everything, starting from one end and moving to the other, taking stock. Pine Ridge was not a large town, but it was a real one, which meant it had accumulated the layers that real places accumulate. The original buildings from whenever it had been settled, built fast and plain, and then the additions and improvements that came as money moved through. A bank with a proper stone facade, a hotel with a painted sign, a church with an actual steeple. There were perhaps 300 people in the town itself, and probably more in the outlying farms and ranches. There was no seamstress. Clara noticed this before she'd made it halfway down the main street. There was a dry goods store that sold bolts of fabric and basic notions. She'd noted it the day before. And there was a woman she saw going into the hotel carrying a basket of mended laundry, which suggested some informal repair work. But there was no dedicated sewing business, no dressmaker's shop. She stood in front of the dry goods store and thought about this. Then she went inside. The proprietor was a man in his 50s named Avery, according to the sign above the door. He was behind the counter sorting nails into bins, which Clara thought was probably not his usual occupation, but he seemed to be doing it because he needed something to do with his hands while he assessed her. "You're the woman from yesterday," he said. "Clara Hawthorne," she said. "Awesome. I'm a seamstress. I see you carry fabric and notions." "I do. Do you have anyone in town doing professional sewing work? Garments, alterations, custom work?" He thought about this. Old Martha Eckert used to take in alterations. She passed last spring. "So there's no one." "There's Mrs. Delacroix at the hotel. She does some mending." "Mending?" Clara said. "That's right." Clara looked at the bolts of fabric arranged along the wall. Wool, cotton, a few linens. The quality was variable. Some of it was reasonable, some of it was the kind of cheap material that frayed badly and didn't hold dye. She looked at the notions, the thread colors, the button selection. "I'm going to need to set up a workspace," she said. "I can't work out of a boarding house room indefinitely." Avery looked at her. "You're planning to stay then?" "I am." There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not disapproval, but something like uncertainty. The look of a man revising an assumption. "You know, people saw what happened yesterday," he said. "I expect they did." "Gerald Pitts isn't a popular man exactly, but he's been here a long time." "I'm sure he has," Clara said. "He's also the reason I'm standing in your store with $4.40 instead of setting up a household, so I'm not particularly interested in taking his circumstances into account." A pause. Then something shifted in Avery's expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "Fair enough," he said. "What do you need?" What she needed was a space. This turned out to be harder than fabric or thread or even customers. The boarding house room was genuinely too small. She needed a table large enough to cut fabric, good light, and enough space to move around a garment without knocking things over. She needed, in short, a proper room, and proper rooms cost money she did not have. She spent 3 days asking around. The response to her presence in Pine Ridge during those 3 days was not friendly, exactly, but it was also not uniform. There were people, mostly women, she noticed, who looked at her with something like cautious interest, the look of people who are waiting to see what you'll do before they commit to an opinion. There were people who were openly cold, and she suspected some of these were friends or acquaintances of Gerald Pitt's. There was a woman named Doris Crane who stopped her on the street to say, with tremendous self-satisfaction, that most women would have left by now, and Clara had looked at her and said, "I suppose I'm not most women," and kept walking. The gossip was constant. She could feel it the way you feel weather, the quick conversations that stopped when she passed, the looks that lasted a beat too long, the way certain people found reasons to be somewhere else when she entered a store. The town had a story about her now. The woman Pitts rejected, the tall woman from Chicago, the one who hadn't left. And she was aware that the story was still being written and that she had some say in how it went. On the 4th day, she found her space. It was a room at the back of the hardware store. This was, she would later acknowledge, something close to absurd. Gerald Pitts's hardware store, which occupied the largest building on Main Street, had a storage room at the back that Pitts had been using to stack broken equipment he meant to repair and never got around to. The room had 2 large windows facing east. It was roughly 15 by 20 feet. It was a disaster of clutter, but underneath the clutter the floor was solid and the walls were good. She did not go to Pitts. She went to the building's owner, a man named Howard Garland, who ran the bank and owned several properties in town, and she asked him about the room directly. Garland was a cautious man. He looked at her over his desk with the expression of someone doing several calculations simultaneously. "That space is occupied by Pitts's lease," he said. "The lease covers the storefront and the main floor," Clara said. She had asked enough questions around town to know this much. "The back storage is listed separately in the original property agreement. I spoke with Mr. Avery this morning, and he confirmed it." Garland blinked. "I'm offering you $2 a month," Clara said. "I'll clean it out myself. I'll make whatever repairs are needed, and I'll operate a legitimate business from it." There was a pause. "You're the woman Pitts turned away," Garland said. "I'm Clara Hawthorne," Clara said. "I'm a professional seamstress with 15 years of experience, and I'd like to rent that room." Another pause. Garland looked at her for a long moment, the way men sometimes looked at her when they were trying to fit her into a category they recognized, and finding that she didn't quite go. $250, he said. $225, Clara said. A short silence, then, $225, first month up front. Clara paid him from the last of her money. She had 60 cents left. She spent 2 days cleaning out the storage room. She did it alone, moving broken equipment out piece by piece and stacking it in the alley, which she explained to Garland and which he arranged to have carted away. She swept the floor 3 times. She wiped down the windows until the east light came in clean and strong. She borrowed a table from Mrs. Halliday, technically rented it, $1/4 a week, and set it under the better window, and she arranged her tools on it with the precision of someone who finds order clarifying. She put a small sign in the front window of the hardware store. She asked Pitts's counterman to pass it along to Garland, since she wasn't about to go through Pitts. That read, "See Hawthorne, seamstress, custom work, alterations, repairs, inquire at back door." Then she waited. The first customer came on a Thursday. She was a young woman, perhaps 22, named Beth Summers, and she came in with the expression of someone who has been talked into something by a friend and is not yet sure if it was a good idea. She had a coat that needed its lining replaced and a wedding dress that needed letting out. She was expecting, she said, with a blush that Clara found rather charming, and nothing fit properly anymore. Clara looked at the coat and the dress. She quoted Beth a price that was fair and said the work would take 3 days. Beth looked at her for a moment. "You're her," she said. "The woman who, Gerald Pitts." "I'm Clara Hawthorne," Clara said. "I'm a seamstress. Would you like the work done?" Beth thought about it for a moment, and then she nodded. By the end of the first week, Clara had 3 clients. By the end of the second, she had 6. The work was not glamorous. It was mostly alterations and repairs, the bread and butter of any sewing business, The work that was never exciting but was always needed. She did it carefully and she did it exactly right, and she charged fair prices. And these things, she knew from 15 years of experience, were the only real advertisement. The gossip did not stop. If anything, it intensified, because now there was something to say. Not just the woman Pitts rejected, but the woman who stayed and opened a sewing shop right there in his building. She heard this particular version of the story secondhand from Beth Summers, who had turned out to be something of a regular client and who had a gift for reporting the town's conversation without appearing to enjoy it too much. Doris Crane says you're doing it to embarrass Gerald, Beth said one afternoon, sitting in the wooden chair Clara had acquired for clients to sit in while they waited. I'm doing it to earn a living, Clara said, pinning the hem of a skirt without looking up. She also says you won't last the winter. The winter is 2 months away, Clara said. I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. What do you think about it all? Beth asked. About staying, I mean. About him. Clara considered this. I think it doesn't matter what I think about it, she said. What matters is whether the work is good, and whether I can keep doing it. Everything else is noise. She said it easily enough, as if she believed it. She mostly did believe it. There were moments, usually in the evenings, back in her boarding house room, when the day had been long and the four walls were very close, when the noise was harder to ignore, when she let herself think about Chicago and what she'd left and whether she'd made the right decision, when she thought about Gerald Pitts and the 30 yards of Main Street and the word inconvenience and felt the heat of it all over again. But she did not allow those moments to last long. She had learned, at some point in her 38 years, that the only reliable antidote to humiliation was competence. You built something good enough that the people who dismissed you had to revise their opinion, even if they revised it privately and never said it out loud. You built it not for them, but for yourself. And then it was yours regardless of what they thought. She was building it. It was slow, and it was uncertain, and there were days when she counted her money twice just to make sure she'd done it right, and the numbers were never as comfortable as she would have liked, but she was building it. She met Colt Mercer on a Wednesday, almost 3 weeks after her arrival. She was at the dry goods store doing her monthly negotiation with Avery over the quality and price of his wool stock. She'd convinced him to order better material on the grounds that her clients would pay more for work that held up, which meant she'd buy more of it, which meant he'd make more money. When the door opened and 2 men came in. The taller of the two was in his mid-40s, she guessed. He was not a tall man exactly, but he was built with a kind of solid, deliberate quality, the way certain things are built to take weight. He had dark hair going gray at the sides and a face that had spent considerable time in weather. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deep, and his jaw was rough with several days' worth of growth, and his hands, when he put them on Avery's counter, were the hands of someone who worked outdoors and hard. He was not handsome in any conventional way. He had the look of a man who had used himself up quite thoroughly on the physical demands of his life and had no particular complaints about it. The second man was younger, 25 or so, broad-shouldered and restless, looking around the store with the impatient energy of someone who'd rather be somewhere else. Mercer, Avery said with the specific warmth of a man greeting a reliable customer. Back already? Need to resupply, the taller man said. His voice was low and direct, no particular inflection. Got a big camp going in next week. 30 men, 6 weeks. I'll need the full list. Write it up, and I'll have it sorted by Friday. Works for me. The younger man, who had been scanning the store, let his gaze land on Clara and hold there for a beat with the unsubtle appraisal of someone who had not yet learned to be less obvious about it. Who's this? He said, not to anyone in particular. Tom, the older man said. Just the name. A particular quality of just the name. Tom looked away. The older man, Mercer, looked at Clara then. Not the way Tom had looked, not an appraisal. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone they have noticed and are deciding what to make of. It was a direct look, unhurried but not rude, and it lasted exactly as long as a look of honest assessment lasts before it becomes something else. Sorry for the interruption, he said, which was not quite an apology and not quite a greeting, but occupied some useful middle ground between the two. You weren't interrupting anything, Clara said. I was finished. She nodded to Avery. They'd completed their negotiation, more or less, and picked up her package and left. She didn't think much about it until that evening, when she was back in her room going over the week's accounts, and she realized that the man in the dry goods store had been the first person in 3 weeks who had looked at her without any apparent agenda, without the gossip calculation of is she going to stay or leave, without the particular watchfulness of people waiting to see if she'd fail, without the slightly uncomfortable guilt of people who'd been present the day Pitts turned her away and weren't sure what to do with that. He'd just looked at her, directly, plainly, as one person looks at another. She filed the observation away and got back to the accounts. She didn't know yet that his name was Colt Mercer, or that he led wilderness camps in the mountains for men who'd been broke down by the various mechanisms of bad luck and bad decisions, or that he'd been doing it for 12 years and had never lost a man. She didn't know that Pine Ridge thought of him the way small places think of someone who is their own particular kind of extraordinary, quietly, with the specific pride of a community that knows it has something worth being proud of. She knew only that he'd looked at her plainly, and that this had been, in 3 weeks of life in Pine Ridge, somewhat unusual. October ended. November arrived with cold mornings and the smell of wood smoke and the kind of sky that Pine Ridge's residents apparently took as a sign that snow was coming. Clara noticed the subtle shift in the town's rhythm that came with the approaching season. People stocking up, moving faster, having a particular quality of attention in their transactions. The attention of people who understood that winter was not theoretical. Her business was growing. Slowly, and not without friction, there were still women in town who avoided her shop for reasons she understood were social rather than practical. But it was growing. She had 8 regular clients now. She had taken on a large contract from the hotel, which needed several sets of staff uniforms repaired and some new aprons made, and this had kept her steadily occupied for 10 days and paid well. She had learned from Beth and from the small accumulation of information that passed through a sewing shop the way water moves through rock, slowly, constantly, a great deal about Pine Ridge. She had learned about the Calloway family, who owned the mountain timber rights and were not loved in town, and whose son Foster Calloway came into the general store twice a week and was always smiled at and never trusted. She had learned about the council, which met monthly and was composed of 5 men who ranged from genuinely civic-minded to genuinely self-interested. She had learned about Colt Mercer's camp in the mountains, which took men who'd been broken by poverty or drink or some combination of the two and put them to work cutting trails and building shelters and doing the physical labor of the backcountry, and which apparently transformed some of them and did nothing for others but at least fed everyone for a season. She had not spoken to Mercer again since the dry goods store. She'd seen him twice in passing, once on the street, where he'd nodded in acknowledgement, and once at the post office, where they'd been waiting for the same window and he'd said, "Cold this morning," and she'd agreed that it was, and that had been the extent of it. She thought about the camp, though. She thought about it because she had a seamstress's habit of thinking about what people were wearing and whether it was sufficient for what they were doing, and what she knew about Mercer's camp suggested that 30 men spending 6 weeks in the mountains in November needed gear that was considerably better than what most of them probably had. Wool coats that were actually wool, not the cheap blended stuff that lost its insulation when it got wet. Proper layering systems. Gloves with reinforced palms. The kind of cold weather equipment that could be the difference in genuine mountain cold between discomfort and real danger. She thought about this, and she thought about her supply of better wool that Avery had ordered, and she thought about the $4.40 she'd started with. And one evening, in early November, she sat down at her work table and she wrote out a proposal. It took her 2 drafts to get it right. The next morning, she went to find Colt Mercer. Shab. He was at the livery stable on the south end of town, apparently in the middle of a conversation with the stable keeper about a horse who had an opinion about something. The horse was expressing its opinion through the medium of not moving, and the stable keeper was explaining why this was going to have to change, and Mercer was standing to the side with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has seen this particular argument before and knows how it ends. He saw Clara approaching and he uncrossed his arms and straightened. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. He remembered her name, which she noted. "Mr. Mercer, do you have a few minutes?" He looked at the horse. The horse had not changed its position. "I think I can spare some," he said. They walked a few paces away from the stable, into the cold morning air, and Clara took out her proposal and handed it to him. He looked at it without speaking for a moment. The proposal was 2 pages. The first page outlined the problem. Men going into mountain conditions in November without adequate cold weather gear. The specific failure modes of typical frontier outerwear in wet cold conditions. The particular risk this represented over 6 weeks at altitude. The second page was her solution. What she could make, in what quantities, in what time frame, at what cost. She had priced it fairly. Not cheap, because cheap would have told him the work wasn't good, and the work would be good. But fair. He read it twice. She watched him read it. "You've thought about this," he said. "I have." "How do you know about mountain conditions?" "I don't personally. I ask people who do. I spoke with Mr. Avery about what kind of fabric holds up. I spoke with a man at the hotel who spent 3 seasons in the Rockies, and I read 2 books I borrowed from the town's very small library." She paused. "I also grew up in Chicago. I understand cold." A short silence. "The prices are reasonable," he said. "They're fair. There's a difference." He looked at her then, over the proposal, with the direct look she remembered from the dry goods store. "Why come to me directly? You could have posted a notice." "A notice would have gotten responses from men who want the cheapest option. I'm not interested in being the cheapest option. I wanted to talk to someone who understands what the equipment is for." He was quiet for a moment. The horse behind them made a decision and moved finally, which prompted a satisfied exclamation from the stable keeper. "I've got 30 men going in the 10th, Mercer said. "I'd need the gear by the 8th. "I can have the core pieces ready by the 7th, Clara said. "If you can commit by tomorrow, so I can start on the materials." He looked at the proposal again. "You can do 30 men's worth of cold gear in 10 days? "I can do 30 men's worth of cold gear in 10 days if I start tomorrow," Clara said. "If I start the day after, I can't promise the timeline." He folded the proposal once and put it in his coat pocket. "I'll come by your shop this afternoon," he said. "I'll be there," she said. She walked back toward Main Street with a pace that she was careful to keep steady, because the urge to walk faster than usual was there, a sort of forward momentum born of something that was not quite excitement, but was in the same general neighborhood. $4.40, she thought. And now here. The mountains were very white and very large against the morning sky. She looked at them for a moment before she turned onto Main Street. She had work to do. Chet. He came to the shop at 3 o'clock as promised. He came alone, without Tom or anyone else, and he stood in the doorway of her workroom for a moment, taking in the space, the long table, the arranged tools, the bolts of fabric stacked along the wall, the drawings she'd pinned up of garment patterns for the camp order. "You've been busy," he said. "I started planning this morning," she said, "once I was fairly sure you'd come." "Fairly sure? You're a man who plans ahead. People don't plan ahead by accident. You read the whole proposal twice. You put it in your pocket. You came." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion that a smile was nearby. "You pay attention," he said. "It's useful in my work," Clara said. "People tell you more in how they move than in what they say, mostly." He came into the room and looked at the drawings she'd pinned up. He looked at them with the same careful attention he'd given the proposal. Not quickly, not performatively, but the genuine attention of a man who is actually trying to understand what he's looking at. "This one," he said, pointing to a jacket pattern. "The overlap here. What's the purpose?" "Wind. If the wind can't find a straight seam to come through, you stay warmer. The overlap creates a baffle." He nodded slowly. "The camps are at 6,400 feet. The wind comes off the ridge from the northwest in November." "Then you want that overlap to face northwest," she said, coming to stand beside him and look at the drawing. "I can adjust the pattern." They spent 40 minutes going through the drawings. It was, Clara would think later, one of the more useful 40 minutes she had spent since arriving in Pine Ridge. Mercer knew things about the mountain conditions that she hadn't been able to find in any conversation or book. Specific details about how cold worked at that altitude, how wet the men got moving through deep snowpack, which parts of the body lost heat fastest when a man was working hard. She knew things he needed to know about fabric behavior and construction and where garments failed under stress. They went back and forth across the drawings, and she made notes, and he made notes, and by the end of it she had a significantly better design than she'd started with. "I need to ask you something," Mercer said when they'd finished. "All right. Why are you still here?" She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "In Pine Ridge," he said. What Pitts did. Most people would have left. I couldn't afford to, she said. It was honest. But even if I could have, I'm not sure I would have. Why not? Clara considered this for a moment. It was a real question, deserving a real answer. Because leaving felt like agreeing with him, she said. Like accepting that his opinion of me was the accurate one, and I don't accept that. He was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, he said, what Pitts did was the act of a small man. I gathered that, she said, but I appreciate you saying so. He put on his coat and picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the corner of her work table. I'll send Tom over tomorrow morning with the measurements, he said. Neck to wrist, shoulder to hip, chest and waist. All 30 men. Have him bring paper, she said. I'll need the numbers written legibly. A pause. Tom doesn't write legibly. Then I'll come to wherever your men are and take the measurements myself. He looked at her for a moment with the direct look that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things, without agenda, without the social calculation that most people layered over their attention. You'd do that? He said. It's my work, she said. The measurements are part of the work. He nodded once, settled his hat, and went to the door. I'll see you the day after tomorrow then, he said. 7 in the morning. Can you be at the north end of Main Street? I can. He left. Clara stood in her workroom for a moment after the door closed, looking at the drawings on the wall. Then she went to her notebook and began the supply calculations. What she had, what she needed, what she'd have to order from Avery on credit, which was a conversation she was not entirely looking forward to but would manage. Outside the window, the light was going gold and the mountains were turning pink at the edges, the way mountains apparently did at this time of year in this part of the world. She had 10 days. She picked up her pencil and got to work. The days that followed were the most focused she'd been since arriving in Pine Ridge. She was at the north end of Main Street at 7 the morning after, wrapped in her own good wool coat, and Mercer was already there, and they rode out to the staging area where his men were camped, a flat field 2 miles north of town that had become a temporary city of canvas and wood smoke and the particular noise of 30 men who knew each other well enough to argue comfortably. She spent 6 hours taking measurements. This was not a quick or comfortable process. The men ranged from slight to enormous, from cooperative to deeply skeptical of the entire enterprise, from polite to the kind of loud and cheerful that required management. There was a man named Douglas who was 6'4" and had arms so long that Clara had to check her tape twice because the number seemed impossible. There was a man called Little Pete who was 5'2" and offended when she measured him quickly, as though she were writing him off, and she slowed down and took her time, and he left somewhat mollified. There was a younger man, barely 20, who looked cold already and kept glancing at the mountains with an expression of barely controlled alarm. First season? She asked him as she measured his chest. Yes, ma'am, he said. What's your name? Russell, Jack Russell. I know, he added preemptively. The gear will be ready before you go in, she said. You'll be fine. She said it with the particular certainty of someone who has committed to making it true, and something in Jack Russell's expression eased slightly. Mercer was there for most of it, moving through the camp with the efficient attention of a man who was always monitoring a great many variables simultaneously. He watched her with the men without appearing to watch her. She noticed this, the way he was present without being intrusive, the way he seemed to understand that the work required its own kind of space. At noon, someone produced food, beef and beans and bread that was dense and good, and she ate with the men because there was nowhere else to eat and because she was hungry, and the meal was accompanied by the kind of conversation that happens when 30 men are suddenly uncertain about a woman in their midst and are dealing with this uncertainty through the medium of competitive storytelling. She listened and she ate, and when the stories got good enough, she laughed genuinely, and she could feel the room, the field, the camp, adjust slightly around her. On the ride back to town, Mercer said, You did well today. They're decent men, she said, and they needed the work done. Most of them are. Some of them are works in progress. Which ones? He considered this. Mitchell, the big one with the red beard. He's been in the camp before. He comes back every year, which is either a good sign or a bad one. I'm still not sure which. And Jack Russell? She asked. That one's going to be all right, Mercer said. He just needs a season to find out what he's made of. He's scared, she said. Most of them are, their first time. The ones who aren't are either very experienced or very stupid. He paused. The ones who are scared and come anyway are usually the most useful people in the camp by the time it's over. Clara thought about this. That sounds like it applies to things other than wilderness camps, she said. He looked at her sidelong, and the thing that was close to a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Probably does, he said. They rode into town as the light was going, and she went directly to her shop and worked until midnight, and she was back at her table by 6 the next morning. 10 days. 30 men. Enough gear to keep them alive in the mountains in November. She had work to do. She did it. The mornings were cold enough now that her fingers were stiff for the first hour, and she kept a small fire going in the corner of the shop and drank 2 cups of coffee before she could really feel her hands. She worked 10 and 11 hours at a stretch, pausing only to eat and to see clients. She hadn't stopped taking other work, because the bills didn't stop, and because she didn't believe in putting everything into one contract, no matter how large. She finished the last jacket at 11 o'clock on the night of November 7th. She was sitting at her work table with the jacket in her hands, checking the stitching on the baffle overlap for the 4th time. It was fine. It had been fine the first time she'd checked it, but 10 days of intensive work had given her a persistent quality of worry about the details, the way you worry about the details when you know exactly what they're for. When there was a knock at her back door, she opened it to find Mercer standing in the cold with a lantern. "Is it done?" he said. "Come in," she said. He came in and looked at the table, where the 30 jackets were folded in stacks. She'd done the jackets first because they were the most complex, and then the supplementary pieces, the reinforced trousers and the gloves and the lined wool vests. The table was covered in folded, finished, labeled pieces. He picked up one of the jackets. He turned it over in his hands. He felt the seams, the baffle, the cuffs. He put it on. It was Mitchell's, she knew from the label, the large man with the red beard, and it fit Mercer poorly, which made the test more honest in a way. He moved his arms in it, raised them, crossed them. "Good," he said. He took it off and refolded it with a care she appreciated. "The measurements are labeled," she said. "Mitchell's is the one you just had." He went through the stacks quickly, checking labels, doing the quick mental inventory of a man who needs to know that everything is there. "Everything's here," he said. "It is." He looked at her then. She was tired. Genuinely, thoroughly tired. The kind of tired that lives in the specific muscles you've been using and also behind the eyes. And she probably looked it. She'd been at the table since 6 that morning. Her hair had escaped its pins sometime around hour 7, and she hadn't bothered to fix it. "You did this in 10 days, he said. "I told you I would." "Most people say what they can do and then make adjustments," he said. "I know what I can do," Clara said. "I don't say things I can't back up." A pause. "I'd like to pay you tonight," he said. "The camp goes in at dawn." "That's not necessary. The terms were delivery and then—" "The terms were my terms," he said. "I'm changing them. You earned the payment before the terms required it." He paid her. He paid her the agreed amount plus a quarter more, and when she started to object, he said, "The adjustments to the baffle design were not in the original agreement. Call it a consulting fee." She took the money. She was not in a position to argue with it, and she was not sure she wanted to. He picked up the lantern and went to the door. "The camp comes back in December," he said. "I'll be in town a few days before. I'd like to talk to you about the winter gear for the next season." "I'll be here," Clara said. He left. She locked the door and stood in the workroom for a moment, alone with the empty work table and the small fire going low in the corner. And she thought about how much money was in her hand and what it meant for the months ahead, and how 3 weeks ago she'd had $4.40 and a narrow room and nowhere to go. She thought about Gerald Pitts and the 30 yards of Main Street and the word inconvenience, and she waited for the heat of it, the habitual burn of that particular humiliation. It was there, but it was smaller than it had been. She put the money in her pocket. She went to find her hairpins and put her hair back in order. She had a very long list of things to do tomorrow, and she needed to get some sleep before she could do any of them. The camp went into the mountains at dawn on November 10th, just as Mercer had said it would. Clara wasn't there to see it go. She heard it. The horses, the loaded wagons, the particular quality of noise that 30 men make when they are moving with purpose in the cold dark before sunrise. from her boarding house room, where she was already awake because she had a full day ahead and because she had never, in her adult life, been a person who slept past 5:30. She lay still and listened to the camp pass through town and then go quiet as it moved north. And then she got up and made her preparations for the day. The money from Mercer's contract had changed things, not dramatically. She was careful with it, careful in the way of someone who remembers exactly what $4.40 feels like, but meaningfully. She had paid Mrs. Halliday 2 more weeks in advance. She had settled her account with Avery and placed a proper order for materials, not on credit this time. She had bought herself a second lamp for the workroom, because the winter light through the east windows was going to get shorter, and she couldn't afford to slow down when the afternoons went dark at 4. What the money had not changed was the town's opinion of her, or rather, it had changed it in some quarters and hardened it in others, and she was learning to read the difference. There were women who now came to her shop with the specific purpose of seeing what she'd done with the camp contract, which translated into actual work orders, often enough that she kept a waiting list for the first time. There were women who still avoided her, though the avoidance had taken on a different quality, less the cold shoulder of genuine disapproval, and more the careful distance of people who had committed to a position and weren't sure how to walk it back without losing face. And then there was Gerald Pitts. Pitts had been quiet in the weeks after her arrival, which she'd taken as either indifference or embarrassment, and she hadn't wasted energy trying to determine which. But sometime around the 3rd week of November, the quality of his silence changed. She became aware of it through the shop, through the clients who mentioned things, carefully and sometimes with genuine discomfort, that she understood she was supposed to know. That Pitts had said something at the Saturday gathering at the hotel. That Pitts had questioned, to someone on the town council, whether it was appropriate for a woman operating a business from a commercial property to be using the building's alley access. That Pitts had mentioned, in Avery's hearing, that a woman who'd arrived under the circumstances she had arrived under was perhaps not the kind of establishment Pine Ridge needed to encourage. Clara heard this and she thought about it carefully, the way she thought about difficult seams, where the stress points were, what was likely to pull, what needed reinforcement. She went to see Howard Garland. Garland was behind his desk at the bank in the usual way, doing the usual calculations with the usual expression. He looked up when she came in with the specific alertness of a man who has been expecting a conversation and is not sure whether to be relieved or unsettled that it's finally arrived. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. "Mr. Garland." She sat down without being invited, which she knew was forward and did it anyway. "I'd like to discuss renewing my lease." A pause. "Your current term runs through the end of February." "I know." She put a folded paper on his desk. "I've written up a proposal for a 12-month renewal beginning in March. The same terms, adjusted for the spring and summer work I'm planning." Garland looked at the paper without picking it up. "I've heard some concerns," he said carefully. "I know you have," Clara said. "I'm here so you can hear the other side of the conversation." He picked up the paper then and read it. Clara waited. She had learned in 15 years of business that the urge to fill silences was almost always counterproductive, and she had trained herself out of it at significant personal cost. "This is a 12-month commitment," Garland said. "Yes. You've been here less than 2 months." "I have. In which time I've paid my rent on schedule, improved the property at my own expense, and brought in revenue that has benefited several other Pine Ridge businesses." She paused. "I've also been the subject of some commentary from a gentleman who shares the building and who, I think you'll agree, has a personal rather than professional interest in my continued operation." Garland set the paper down. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic that is not entirely about money. $350 a month, he said, for 12 months. $325, Clara said. $340, and I'll have the alley access formalized in the lease so there's no further discussion about it. Clara thought about this for approximately 3 seconds. "Done," she said. She stood and shook his hand, and she left before he could think of reasons to revise his position. Outside on the street, the November cold was sharp and the sky was the color of iron. She walked back toward the shop with the deliberate pace she'd developed, not the forced steadiness of her first days in Pine Ridge, when she'd been managing herself constantly, but something more natural now, the pace of a woman who knew where she was going. She passed the front of the hardware store. Pitts was in the window. He wasn't looking at her. He was arranging something on the display shelf, his back partly turned, But she had the distinct sense that he was aware of her passing in the way that people are aware of things they are pretending not to look at. She did not alter her pace. She did not look in the window. She went to her shop and hung up her coat and put another piece of wood on the small fire and sat down at her work table, and she thought, $340 in 12 months is the price of staying. That's what this is. That's the number. She could make that number work. She'd made harder numbers work before. She picked up the jacket she'd been working on, Beth Summers' sister, who was getting married in the spring and wanted something for the ceremony. And she threaded her needle and got back to it. The winter set in for real the last week of November. Pine Ridge under snow was a different animal than Pine Ridge in the dry, bright cold of autumn. The snow came down in the kind of sustained, serious way that the mountains apparently encouraged, and the town contracted around itself the way all cold weather communities do. The streets emptying earlier, the storefronts more purposeful, the social life moving indoors. The hotel's common room became a gathering point in the evenings. The boarding house dining table, which Mrs. Halliday kept heated past any reasonable necessity, became louder and more occupied. Clara's shop, by contrast, became a destination. This surprised her. She had expected the winter to slow things down. She had planned for it, budgeted for the slower weeks that every sewing business experienced when the weather turned. What she hadn't planned for was that the cold itself would generate work. Women who had postponed alterations because they could get by without them suddenly needed heavier curtains, needed the gaps in their coats mended, needed their children's winter clothes let out because children grew regardless of the season. The hotel needed 2 more sets of staff uniforms because the ones she'd repaired in the fall weren't holding up to the frequency of washing. And then there were the women who came simply to sit for a while. She noticed this starting in late November, and she had complicated feelings about it. The clients who came in for work and then lingered, asking questions about the work, watching her cut fabric or stitch, sometimes bringing their own mending to do while they talked, were not, she understood, there entirely for sewing purposes. They were there the way people are drawn to somewhere warm when the outside is cold, and something about the atmosphere of the place creates a quality of permission that isn't found everywhere. Beth Summers was the most consistent of these visitors. She would come in twice a week, sometimes with her own mending, sometimes with nothing at all, and she would sit in the client chair and talk in the comfortable, ranging way of someone who trusts that the conversation will find its own level. "Doris Crane is coming around," Beth said one afternoon, apropos of apparently nothing. Clara didn't look up from the curtain panel she was hemming. "Is she? She was asking about you at the hotel gathering last week. What you were like, whether you'd settled in, whether you were staying." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were settled in and staying, and that you were the best seamstress I'd ever taken work to." A pause. She looked like she'd bitten into something sour. "You don't care, do you?" Beth said. It wasn't quite a question. Clara thought about this. "I care less than I did 2 months ago," she said honestly. "I'm not sure if that's wisdom or just exhaustion." Beth laughed. She had a good laugh, unguarded and real. "Maybe both," she said. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Beth with her mending, Clara with the curtain panel. The fire was going well, and the east windows showed a gray sky and the quiet, persistent fall of snow. "Can I ask you something?" Beth said eventually. "You can ask." Colt Mercer. A pause. Clara continued hemming. "He came to see you before the camp went in. People noticed." "He came to pick up a business order," Clara said. 30 sets of mountain gear. It was a transaction." "People don't only see transactions when they're watching," Beth said, with the gentle precision of someone making a small but important point. "I'm aware," Clara said. "I also can't control what people see or don't see, so I don't spend a great deal of energy trying." "He's a good man," Beth said. "I just wanted to say that. Whatever else people are saying." Clara set down the curtain panel and looked at her. "What else are people saying?" Beth looked slightly caught. "Just, you know how things get interpreted. A woman alone, a man who's respected in town. People fill in what they don't know." "And what are they filling in?" "Nothing specific, just the usual speculation." She paused. "I think most people who like you are hoping something comes of it, and the ones who don't like you are hoping you'll do something they can point at." Claire picked up the curtain panel again. "Well," she said, I hope both groups have something else to occupy their attention, because there is nothing to come of it and nothing to point at. But even as she said it, she was aware of a slight dishonesty in the statement. Not about Mercer himself. Their interaction had been purely professional, and she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond that boundary because the boundary was sensible, but about her own attention. She was aware that she had thought about the 40 minutes going through the drawings more than once, about the way he'd taken the coat apart with his hands rather than his eyes, about the ride back to town and the thing he'd said about the men who are scared and come anyway. She hemmed the curtain panel and let the subject drop, and Beth, who was perceptive enough to know when a subject had been set down and not just moved, let it drop too. December arrived. The camp came back from the mountains. She heard about it before she saw it. The news moved through town the way news always moved through Pine Ridge, faster than any formal communication system. 30 men. The camp was back. Mercer was in. They'd had a difficult last 2 weeks. Something about the snow coming down harder than expected, and all 30 men were accounted for, and none of them had frostbite, which was apparently the benchmark by which successful mountain camps were measured. She was in her shop when Mercer came in. He looked like the mountains. He had the weathered, somewhat compressed quality of a man who had spent 6 weeks at altitude in serious cold, the look of someone whose reserves had been used and not yet replenished. He was thinner than she remembered. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body is operating on the deferred promise of rest. But he was upright, and he walked into her shop without knocking because she never locked it during business hours, and he looked around at the space, which was considerably more organized and better equipped than it had been when he'd last seen it, and he said, "The gear worked." "I know," she said. "I heard." All 30 men back with no frostbite and no major cold injuries. He set his hat on the corner of the work table, which she was already coming to understand was where he put his hat. That hasn't happened in 3 seasons. What was different in previous seasons? The gear, he said simply. She had the satisfaction of this, which she allowed herself to feel for a moment before setting it aside, because there was always more work and satisfaction was a thing you held briefly and then put down. "Sit," she said, because he looked like a man who needed to sit down. "I'll get tea." He sat, somewhat heavily, in the client chair. She put water on the small stove she'd acquired in November, the one that heated the corner of the shop and on which she had gotten in the modest habit of keeping a kettle going during the cold months. "The young one," Mercer said. "Russell. He finished the season well." "I told him he would." "How did you know?" "I didn't," Clara said. "But it seemed worth saying regardless." She brought 2 cups and she sat across from him at the work table, and they drank tea in the specific, comfortable silence of 2 people who are not quite accustomed to sitting across from each other in this way, but are not uncomfortable with it either. "I want to talk to you about next season," he said, "and about winter gear generally. I've got contacts in 3 other camps in the territory who'd be interested in sourcing equipment." Claire looked at him. "3 other camps?" "Possibly 4. I've been talking to a man in Cartwright, another in the high country east of here. They've been having the same cold injury problems." He wrapped both hands around the teacup with the unself-consciousness of someone who is genuinely cold and not concerned with appearances. "What I'm proposing is a larger contract, ongoing, something that would take you through the year." Clara thought about the 12-month lease she'd just signed. She thought about the number $340 and what came on the other side of that number if the work held. "How large?" she said. He told her. She kept her face still, which required some effort, because the number was considerably larger than she had expected. Not extravagant. Mercer was not the kind of man who made extravagant gestures, she was already sure of that, but substantial in the way that changed the arithmetic of a business from managing scarcity to managing growth. "I'd need to bring someone on," she said, thinking aloud. "I can't produce that volume alone, not at the quality standard I work to. Can you find someone?" "Probably. Mrs. Delacroix at the hotel does mending, but she hasn't done anything more complex than that in years, from what I understand. There's a woman in the south part of town. I've heard she used to sew professionally before her husband's ranch work kept her busy. I'd need to talk to her." "How long would you need to decide?" "A week," Clara said. "That's fast." "You need an answer before the weather clears and the other camps start making other arrangements," she said. "A week is what the situation allows." He looked at her with the direct look. You understand the supply side as well as the product side. I've been doing this a long time, she said. You learn what moves at what speed. He finished his tea and he stood up and he picked up his hat and he looked at her across the work table. There's something else, he said. He said it with a particular quality of deliberateness, the way a man addresses something he's been deciding whether to address. All right, she said, I heard about the conversation Pitts has been having around town. About your lease, about the alley access, about... He stopped, started again. About whether your being here is appropriate. Clara set down her teacup. And, she said evenly, and I wanted you to know that I spoke to Howard Garland last week. Before you did, I think. I told him that your work was the best I'd gotten from any supplier in 12 years, and that if Pine Ridge was the kind of town that let a man's wounded pride run out a competent woman, then Pine Ridge didn't deserve the reputation it had. The workroom was very quiet. You didn't have to do that, Claire said. I know I didn't. I handled it, she said. I talked to Garland myself. I have the lease. I know you do, he said. And you would have gotten it with or without me saying anything. I know that too. He turned his hat in his hands, a small, uncharacteristic gesture, the movement of a man who is not certain of his footing. I said it because it was true, and because the situation warranted it, not because I thought you needed defending. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said. She meant it. He nodded once and left. She sat in the workroom after he'd gone and looked at the teacups and the work table and the east window showing the steady gray December sky. She thought about what he'd said to Garland, the best I'd gotten from any supplier in 12 years. And she thought about the camp contract and the 3 other camps in the territory and the woman in the south end of town who used to sew professionally. She thought about Gerald Pitts in his hardware store window, not looking at her, pretending not to look at her. She thought, the man who rejected her in front of the whole town cannot stand that she is here. She could feel this with a certainty that didn't require evidence, not because she was consumed by it, but because she understood exactly what was happening. He had expected her to leave. When she hadn't left, he had expected her to fail. When she hadn't failed, he had started trying to create the conditions for failure by moving against her lease, by talking about her in public rooms, by manufacturing the kind of sustained quiet pressure that small places could generate around a person who didn't fit. And it wasn't working. She picked up her sewing and she worked until the light through the east windows was completely gone and the fire needed feeding and Mrs. Halliday's bell was ringing 2 streets over for supper. She had a week to decide about the contract. She already knew what she was going to decide. She was going to say yes, and she was going to find the woman on the south end of town, and she was going to build something real enough that it couldn't be moved by one man's opinion of her height or his embarrassment about being wrong. She was going to stay. Not because she had nowhere to go. That had been true in the beginning, but it wasn't true anymore. She had money now, and the lease, and enough of a reputation that Chicago would probably take her back if she went. She was going to stay because Pine Ridge was beginning, against her better expectations, to feel like something. She wasn't ready to name the something yet, but she felt it the way you feel the first real heat of spring, not warm enough to count on, not permanent, but present, and moving in the right direction. Outside the window, Pine Ridge was quiet under its snow. Somewhere up the street, the hotel common room was lit and occupied. Somewhere in the boarding house, Mrs. Halliday was setting the supper table with the particular energy of a woman who considers punctuality a moral position. And somewhere in the back of Clara's mind, a number was settling. Not 340, not the camp contract amount, but something larger and less precise. The accumulated sum of everything she had built in 2 months from nothing, everything she intended to build from here. She put on her coat and went out into the cold. The woman on the south end of town was named May Sutton, and she had been sewing since she was 7 years old. Clara found her on a Thursday morning in the second week of December in a small house set back from the road behind a fence that had seen better years. May answered the door with flour on her hands and the wariness of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought uncomplicated things. She was 44, sturdy and direct, with calloused hands, and the kind of face that registered things quickly and kept its own counsel about them. Clara introduced herself. She saw the recognition move across May's face. The seamstress, the woman Pitts had turned away, yes, she knew who Clara Hawthorne was. And she watched May make a decision about that recognition and file it somewhere that wasn't going to interfere with the conversation. "I heard you used to do professional work," Clara said. "Garments, not just mending." "Used to," May said. "That was before the ranch took everything." "Is the ranch still taking everything?" A pause. "Less than it was. My husband passed in September." "I'm sorry," Clara said, and she meant it plainly without making it into a performance. May looked at her for a moment. "What kind of work are you talking about?" "Volume work," Clara said. "Mountain gear primarily, but expanding. I need someone who can hold to a standard and work at pace. The pay is fair. I'll show you the numbers. I don't believe in keeping the financial terms vague until after someone's committed." May looked at her for another moment, and then she opened the door wider and said, "Come in then." They talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, May Sutton had agreed to come on 3 days a week, starting after the new year, at a rate that Clara had worked out to be fair to both of them. May had looked at the numbers without pretending not to care about them. She needed the money. She was a widow with 2 grown children elsewhere and a house that needed repairs. And the kind of pride that refuses to acknowledge practical reality was a luxury she couldn't afford. Clara respected this. She walked back to the shop with the particular quality of energy that came from a plan moving from theoretical to real. The week Mercer had given her was almost up. She sent a message to the hotel, where he was staying between camps, and the next morning he came to the shop. She told him yes. He sat across from her at the work table in the usual way now. It had become the usual way, she realized, somewhere in the past few weeks, and he listened while she laid out how she was going to fulfill the contract. May Sutton. The adjusted production schedule. The supply arrangements with Avery and the additional fabric source she'd identified in the nearest large town, 30 miles east. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to appreciate as one of his more consistent qualities. When she finished, he said, "You've thought this through." "I wouldn't have said yes otherwise," she said. "Some people say yes and then think it through." "I know," she said. "I've worked with those people. I don't operate that way." A small silence. Outside, the December street was quiet and cold, and the snow that had fallen overnight was still undisturbed in the places that traffic hadn't reached yet. "The Cartwright contact will want samples before he commits," Mercer said. "I can take them when I ride that way in January." "I'll have samples ready by the end of December," Clara said. 3 complete sets, different build sizes. He nodded. He had his tea. She'd put the kettle on before he arrived, which she did now as a matter of course without thinking about it too much, and he turned the cup in his hands in the way he had. "How are things otherwise?" he said. The question was general enough to mean several things, and she thought he knew that and was leaving the interpretation to her. "Pitts has been quieter," she said, "since the lease renewed. I think Garland made it clear the conversation was over." "Good. The business is growing. I have a waiting list now, which I didn't expect in December." She paused. "And the town has mostly made up its mind about me, I think. The ones who were going to come around have come around. The ones who weren't, haven't." "That sounds like you're at peace with it." "I'm practical about it," she said. "Peace is something else." He looked at her with the direct look. "What's something else?" Clara considered this. It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer, and she was a person who tended toward honesty even when vagueness would have been easier. "I'm still angry sometimes," she said, "about how I arrived here, about what it cost to get to where I am now. I don't think about it every day anymore, but it's still there when I poke at it." She set down her own cup. "I don't think that's something you work through. I think it's something you carry differently over time." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "That seems right," he said. They sat with that for a moment, the way 2 people sit with something that has been said plainly and doesn't need anything added to it. He left shortly after. She watched him go down the back alley toward the street, his hat against the cold, and she thought about what Beth had said. People fill in what they don't know. And she thought that what she knew was that she looked forward to these conversations in a way that was different from how she looked forward to other parts of her day. And that this was information worth acknowledging even if she wasn't sure yet what to do with it. She went back to work. January passed in a sustained productive blur. May Sutton started the second week of the year and proved to be everything Clara had hoped for: precise, quick learning, and possessed of the particular professional dignity of someone who had been good at something for a long time and was glad to be doing it seriously again. They worked well together with the natural ease of two women who had both spent their lives in rooms that ran on order and competency, and who didn't need to discuss the values that governed their work because they shared them without having negotiated them. The shop, which had been Clara's solitary domain, became something different with two people in it. The days had more conversation, which was sometimes welcome and sometimes required management, but the work moved faster. The samples for the Cartwright contact were finished a week ahead of schedule. Mercer took them when he rode east and came back with a commitment that added a third of the Cartwright camp's men to the next season's order. February was harder, not the business. The business continued its steady growth, and the waiting list lengthened, and Clara made a decision in the second week to raise her prices modestly on new clients, which Avery told her was overdue and which she'd been reluctant to do until the quality of the waiting list confirmed she could sustain it. The work was fine. It was the weather that was hard. Pine Ridge in February was a different animal than Pine Ridge in November or December. The cold had settled in with the determined permanence of something that had found a good position and wasn't moving. The snow was not the fresh, clean snow of early winter, but the deep, compressed, gray-edge snow of a season that had been going a long time. The mountains, which had seemed extraordinary to Clara in October, were now simply large and implacable and occasionally frightening in the way of things that do not care about you in any direction. She heard about the avalanche on a Thursday. She was at the work table when she heard a particular quality of commotion on the main street. Not the usual noise of a market day or the hotel crowd, but something sharper and more urgent. The sound of people converging with purpose. She went out to the front of the building and saw a small group forming at the north end of the street. And then she saw Tom, Mercer's young assistant, riding in hard and fast, his horses breathing visible in the cold air from 50 feet away. She moved toward the group without deciding to. Tom was off his horse before it had fully stopped, and he was talking to two men Clara didn't know, talking fast, and what she heard when she got close enough was, "Avalanche, North Ridge, 4 men down, Mercer." "Where is he?" she said. Tom looked at her. His face was the face of someone who had been moving fast for a long time and had not yet had the space to be afraid. "He went back in for the last 2 men, Tom said. "The slide was still moving and he went back in. We got out. We don't know if—" He stopped. The group around them had grown. Clara looked at the faces and saw what communities look like when something has happened to the person they have organized themselves around. The specific, slightly unmoored quality of people whose reliable fixed point has been disrupted. "How long ago?" she said. 2 hours. Maybe 2.5. It's a 3-hour ride. Tom looked back at the road. Henderson and Burke went back with the horses. They should be bringing... And then there was a different sound from the north end of the street, and everyone turned. They came in slowly. Henderson and Burke, as Tom had said, and behind them a wagon that had been turned into something improvised, a flatbed with blankets, and on it 3 men, and one of those men was Mercer. Clara had a very specific moment of clarity in which she understood that the thing she had been carrying in the back of her mind for the past 2 months, the thing she had called information worth acknowledging and then not looked at too directly, was considerably heavier than she had accounted for. She moved through the crowd. He was conscious, which she understood immediately was the most important thing, and around which she organized her reaction. He was conscious, and he was looking at the sky with the focused, slightly bewildered expression of a man who is in considerable pain and is managing it by narrowing his attention to the most immediate sensory input available. His left arm was at a wrong angle. There was blood, dried and dark, along the left side of his face. He was very cold, the kind of cold you can see in someone. The color of their skin, the particular stillness. Dr. Ambrose was already pushing through from the other side. Clara stepped back to give him room because this was not a situation where she was the most useful person in the center of it, and she knew it. She stayed, though. She stood at the edge of the circle, and she watched and she waited, and when they moved him to the doctor's house on the side street, she followed at a distance. She didn't go inside. There was no reason for her to be inside. She was not family. She was not a physician's assistant. She was a business associate and possibly a friend, which were both insufficient credentials for the room where they were working on him. She stood outside in the cold for a period of time she didn't try to measure, and then Tom came out. "He's going to be all right," Tom said. He said it with the emphasis of someone who has been told this and is saying it to himself as much as anyone. Doc says the arm is broken in 2 places, but it's set right. The ribs. 2 broken ribs. The cold is the worst of it right now, just getting him warm. He stopped. He went back in for Peterson and Daly, got them both out before the second slide hit, took the edge of it trying to get clear. Clara said nothing for a moment.
He got them both out? She said.
Both of them, Tom said. She nodded slowly. He's going to be laid up a while, Tom said, and something in his voice shifted slightly, the practical young man hedging toward something less practical. There's not a lot of family, Miss Hawthorne. His brother's in Nevada. It's going to be... I'll help where I can, but I'm not much for the... I'll check on him, Clara said. Tom looked at her with something that was not quite relief, but was in the neighborhood of it. He'd probably say he doesn't need... I know he would, she said. I'll check on him anyway. She went back to the shop. She sat at the work table and she put her hands flat on the surface and she breathed for a moment because the afternoon had accumulated a series of shocks that she hadn't fully processed yet, and her body was aware of this even if her mind had been managing it efficiently. He was going to be all right. She said it once, out loud, to nobody, and then she picked up the jacket she'd been working on and went back to the seam. The next day she went to see him. Dr. Ambrose's house had a room set aside for convalescing patients, which in a frontier town was a necessary feature, and Mercer was in it, propped up in a way that suggested the doctor had argued with him about how much he was allowed to sit up and had won a partial victory. His left arm was in a splint. The left side of his face had a long bruised abrasion along the cheekbone. He looked, overall, like a man who had argued with a mountain and had been mostly correct about his own survival, but had taken the margin of error in the form of significant personal damage. You didn't have to come, he said. I know, she said. She sat in the chair beside the bed without ceremony. How's the arm? It's broken, he said, with the particular flatness of a man who has been asked this question several times already. How's the pain? Managed. A pause. The ribs are worse than the arm. Every time I breathe. He stopped. Does it help to know Peterson and Daly are fine? It helps considerably, he said. It's the reason I'm not more annoyed about the ribs. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her with the direct look, though it had a slightly different quality in it today. Thinner, somehow, the way a person's defenses thin when they have been through something that cost them. Tom said there's not much family nearby, she said. My brother is in Nevada, he said. We get along fine at a distance. He'll be informed. What do you need? He looked at her. I'm all right. I didn't ask if you were all right, she said. I asked what you need. A short silence. Outside the doctor's house, the street was the usual February business, muffled by snow and cold. I have letters I need written, he said. To the other camps, to the Cartwright contact, to the families of the men who were hurt. My right hand is fine, but the ribs make it difficult to sit at a desk. I can write them, she said. I'll need to dictate. That's how it generally works, she said. Something moved in his expression, not quite the almost smile, but related to it. You're very practical, he said. You say that like it's an observation, she said. You've known this about me since November. I know, he said. I just keep noticing it. She came back the next day with paper and a good pen, and she sat beside him while he dictated, and she wrote in her clear, even hand. She had good handwriting, the kind that came from years of labeling patterns and keeping accounts, and the letters were done in 2 hours. She read them back to him, and he made 3 corrections and then said they were right. She came back the day after that with the next thing he needed, which was the camp's supply account sorted, because the avalanche had interrupted the season and there were materials that needed to be accounted for and returned or written off. She was better at this than he was, which he acknowledged without embarrassment, and they worked through the accounts together at a small table that the doctor had agreed could come into the room. By the 3rd visit, it was simply understood that she would come, and he stopped beginning the visits by saying he didn't need her there, and she stopped beginning them by explaining why she'd come anyway. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. Pine Ridge was not a place where things happened without being observed and discussed and interpreted, and Clara Hawthorne going to see Colt Mercer every day while he recovered was the kind of development that a small town in February, when there was not a great deal else happening, was going to pay attention to. She was aware of this the way she was always aware of the town's attention. As a background fact, neither surprising nor particularly manageable, simply part of the environment she operated in. What surprised her was who said something about it first. It was not Beth, who had the grace to wait. It was not Mrs. Halliday, though she had opinions about everything and expressed them freely. It was Gerald Pitts. She was coming out of the doctor's house on a Thursday afternoon, the fourth day of visiting, when Pitts appeared at the end of the narrow side street. He was not, she thought, there by accident. He was dressed in his good coat, and he had the slightly overcomposed expression of a man who has prepared what he intends to say. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. She stopped. She looked at him. She waited. I thought it was time to say something," he started. "About what, Mr. Pitts?" He shifted his weight. "About how things have turned out. I want you to know that I never intended, that is, what I said when you arrived. I may have... You rejected me in front of the whole town because you thought I was too tall," Clara said, in the even tone she used when she wanted to be absolutely clear. "I don't need you to reframe it." His jaw tightened. "I was trying to apologize." "I understand that," she said, "but an apology doesn't change what happened, and I don't think you're apologizing because you believe you were wrong. I think you're apologizing because things have gone differently than you expected, and you'd like the record adjusted." A pause. Something in his expression shifted from embarrassment to something harder. "You've made quite a project of showing me up," he said. "Haven't you?" "I've made quite a project of building a business," she said. "If those look the same to you, that's your concern, not mine." "You're operating out of my building." "I'm operating out of Howard Garland's building," she said, "under a 12-month lease. You're welcome to verify this." She walked past him. She was halfway to Main Street when he said, "Mercer will recover and go back to the mountains." "Then what?" She did not stop. She did not turn around. "Then I'll still have the business," she said, and she kept walking. She thought about that exchange for the rest of the day, not with the burning quality that his words had once produced in her, but with a cooler, more considered attention. He was afraid of something, she thought, not of her specifically, but of what she represented, the version of events in which he had been wrong and she had been right, in which the woman he dismissed had built something real while he'd been standing in his window watching. The small men, Mercer had said. And he'd been right. Mercer was out of bed by the end of the second week, which Dr. Ambrose viewed as premature, and which Mercer achieved by simply getting out of bed and being already upright when the doctor came to argue about it. The arm was still splinted, the ribs were the real obstacle, and they remained the real obstacle for the next 3 weeks, during which he moved carefully and breathed shallowly and made no complaints because complaining was apparently not something he did. He came to the shop when he was mobile enough in the afternoons. These were different from the early visits, the proposal meeting, the tea after the camp returned, the supply discussions. There was still business to discuss because there was always business to discuss, but the business had developed a habit of arriving and then receding, leaving room for other things. He would sit in the client chair and she would work, and they would talk in the way that two people talk when they have moved past the testing period and are simply themselves with each other. She learned things. He had grown up in Ohio, the second of 4 boys, a family that had valued hard work and not much else. He had come west at 22 for reasons he described as compound, restlessness, a girl who'd made it clear she preferred someone else, and a broader sense that the life he was aimed at wasn't actually the one he wanted. He had found the mountains and found that they suited him in ways that level ground did not. He had started the camp 12 years ago with nothing and had built it to what it was through the particular combination of credibility and competence that was the only real currency in that kind of work. He had been married once. He said this without evasion, but also without elaboration, and she understood the shape of it without needing the details. A marriage that hadn't worked, that had ended in the particular sad way of 2 people who had been better separately than together. He had been alone since, which in his life meant the mountains, the camps, the work, and occasional weeks in town that had their own pleasures and their own limitations. Clara told him things in return because the conversation was equitable or it was nothing, and she was not interested in nothing. She told him about Chicago, the workroom with the good northern light, the 15 years of building a business that had been hers and worked and had fit her life exactly right until she'd decided, at 38, that fitting was not the same as flourishing. She told him about the letters from Gerald Pitts, which she described without heat now, because the distance of 4 months had changed their weight. She told him about her mother, who had been a seamstress too, and who had taught her that the thing you make with your hands is always more honest than the thing you make with your words. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without the half attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak. One afternoon in early March, when the light through the east windows had the first real quality of spring in it, still thin, still provisional, but angled differently than it had been all winter, he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked up from the pattern she was cutting. "All right," she said. "When the season opens and I go back in, and I'm going back in, regardless of what Ambrose says about the ribs." "I know you are," she said. "I want to know if—" He stopped. He had his hat in his hands, which she'd come to understand was the gesture of a man working through something. "I want to know if you'd be willing to come out to the staging camp, before we go in, to look at the gear, but also I want to show you what it is, what the work looks like from the inside." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said. "Because you've been making equipment for men doing this work for months and you've never seen the work itself," he said. "And because—" He stopped again. "Because I'd like you to see it. That's the honest version." She looked at him across the work table. The light was coming in at the new angle, the March angle, and it fell across the table between them in a way that was different from how it had fallen all winter. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded once, and the thing that was close to a smile settled briefly on his face, and then he put his hat on and stood up and said he'd let her get back to work. She got back to work. But the light had changed, she thought. Or she had. Or both, which was probably more accurate, since those things tended to move together. Outside the east window, somewhere past the town and the flat land and the long approach, the mountains were still white and still large and still entirely indifferent to the small human business happening at their feet. They had been there before Pine Ridge existed, and they would be there after. And in the broad sweep of that fact, the story of one woman's difficult winter was nothing. But inside the shop, in the thin March light, with 2 good cups of tea going cold on the work table and a pattern half cut and a stack of orders for spring garments that meant the business had made it through to the other side, the story felt like something. It felt like the beginning of something, specifically, though she was too careful to say that out loud. She finished the cut, pinned the pieces, and started the next one. Spring came to Pine Ridge the way it always did in mountain country. Not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard freeze. Mud that dried and then became mud again. The snow on the lower slopes retreating grudgingly, leaving behind a landscape that was half brown and half white, and entirely provisional, as if the season hadn't committed yet to its own arrival. Clara had been in Pine Ridge 5 months. She thought about this on a morning in late March, when she was walking to the shop in the early light, and the air had the particular smell of thaw. Cold still, but with something underneath it, something alive and moving. 5 months. She had arrived with a trunk and a sewing kit and $4.40, and the specific hollow feeling of a plan that had failed publicly and completely. She had now a 12-month lease, a business with a waiting list, a working partnership with May Sutton that had settled into the comfortable efficiency of 2 people who understood each other's methods, and a contract that extended through 3 mountain camps and into the next season. She had, she thought carefully, a life here. Not the life she'd planned when she boarded the train in Chicago. That life had never existed outside the letters she'd exchanged with a man who turned out to be smaller than his correspondent suggested. But a life that was real in hers and built from the ground up in the way that things built from the ground up tend to hold better than things that are handed to you. The staging camp visit happened in the first week of April. Mercer's ribs had been cleared by Dr. Ambrose in late March, the doctor making the pronouncement with the resigned expression of a man who knows his patient has already decided and is simply waiting for the medical formality to catch up. The arm was out of the splint. He had spent March in town, longer than he usually stayed, Clara understood from Tom, who mentioned it with the slightly weighted casualness of someone noting a departure from routine without commenting on its cause. And he had used the time to plan the spring season in detail, meeting with the other camp leaders, reviewing equipment, making arrangements. On a Tuesday morning, he came to the shop and said, "Tomorrow, if you're still willing." "I said I was willing," Clara said. "I'm still willing." They rode out before sunrise. The staging area was different in spring than it had been in November, when she'd gone to take measurements from 30 cold and skeptical men. The flat field north of town was occupied again, but the quality of the occupation was different. Spring work was lighter in some ways, more mobile, the camps going into the mountains to do trail work and shelter maintenance rather than the heavy winter labor. The men were the same mix, some of whom she recognized, Tom and Henderson and the enormous Mitchell with his red beard and Jack Russell, who had survived his first season and had the particular transformed quality that Mercer had predicted, and also some new faces, new men coming in for their first season. Mercer walked her through the camp with the ease of a man entirely in his element, which was its own kind of thing to witness. He was different here than he was in town, or not different exactly. He was the same person, the same quality of attention, and the same direct manner. But the mountains seemed to operate on him the way good light operates on a landscape, clarifying rather than changing. He showed her the equipment she'd made, now in use and already showing the marks of a season's hard work. The seams she'd reinforced were holding. The baffles on the jackets were doing exactly what she'd designed them to do. Mitchell held up his jacket with the pride of a man exhibiting something that had served him well, and she felt the honest satisfaction of work that had done its job. "The left cuff on mine wore through faster than the rest," Jack Russell said, presenting the information with the earnest helpfulness of someone who has been thinking about how to be useful. "Right at the wrist bone." Clara looked at it. He was right. The wear point was exactly where the wrist bone would press against the fabric during repetitive motion. She made a note. "I'll reinforce that point on the new order," she said. "Add a wear patch inside." "That's worth knowing," Mercer said, and she could hear in it the particular approval of a man who values the feedback loop between the field and the workroom. She stayed most of the day. She ate with the men at the noon meal, which had become less strange than it was the first time, and she answered questions about the gear with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who understood what she was talking about and didn't need to soften it. She talked to 3 of the new men about fit. She'd taken their measurements from the list Mercer had sent, but bodies were different in motion than on paper, and she wanted to verify. On the ride back to town, in the long gold light of an April afternoon, Mercer said, "You fit in out there." "I didn't expect to," she admitted. "Why not?" "I'm not a camp person generally," she said. "I'm a workroom person. I know my way around fabric, and I'm comfortable in enclosed spaces doing detailed work. Large groups of men in outdoor conditions are not my natural habitat." "You'd never know it," he said. "I pay attention," she said. "That helps in most situations." They rode in comfortable silence for a while. The mountains were behind them, still white on the upper slopes, and the lower hills were going green in the tentative way of early spring, and the sky was that particular deep blue of a clear April evening in high country. "I want to ask you something," Clara said. "All right," he said. "What's happening with the Callaway timber rights?" There was a pause. Not a long one, but a specific one. The pause of someone who has been expecting a question and is deciding how to answer it. "What have you heard?" he said. "Enough to know something is happening," she said. "Foster Callaway has been in town twice in the past 2 weeks. He's been meeting with council members individually, not collectively. Avery told me Callaway went to see Howard Garland twice. And someone told May that there's a proposal going to the council next month about the Northern Forest access." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "The Callaway family holds the timber rights to about 4,000 acres of the northern slopes," he said. "They've held them for 15 years and done almost nothing with them. Taken some timber, not much, mostly held the land as a hedge against future value. Now Foster wants to extend the rights into the high country and put in a logging road." "Through where?" Clara said. "Through the watershed," he said. "The Upper Creek Basin that feeds the Pine Ridge water supply runs directly through the land he wants access to. A logging road up there. The runoff alone would—" He stopped. "It would take 5 years for the damage to be visible in the town's water, and another 10 for people to understand where it came from, but it would happen." "And the camps?" Clara said. "My spring and summer trails run through that basin," he said. "If Callaway gets the road, the trail access is gone. The camp as it operates now is gone." A pause. "But that's the smaller part of it. The water is the larger part. Does the council know this?" "Some of them," he said. "Garland understands land use well enough to see it if he looks. Fenwick," he said the name with the specific flatness of a considered opinion. "Fenwick will go where the money points. And Callaway has money." Robert Fenwick was one of the 5 council members. and the one whose name Clara had heard most often in the context of Pine Ridge politics. He was a cattleman with holdings east of town and the kind of civic involvement that was more about protecting his own interests than about the civic part, or so the consensus at the shop's client chair seemed to run. "What's the proposal?" she said. "Extended rights plus a development bond," Mercer said. Callaway puts up a bond against development promises. New jobs, the road itself creates employment, and the council votes to expand his access. The bond looks like accountability, but there's no real enforcement mechanism. The Callaway family has friends in the territorial government who would see to that. When does it go to the council? First Monday of May. Clara thought about this for the rest of the ride. She thought about it that evening and the next day and the day after that. She thought about it while she worked and while she talked to May and while she sat at the table in her room at the boarding house going over the accounts. She thought about the water and about the trails and about Pine Ridge 5 years from now and 10 years from now. And she thought about what she now understood about how this town worked, the council, the money, the way influence moved through small places like weather, invisible until it arrived. She had been in Pine Ridge 5 months. She had no standing in the formal sense. She was not a landowner, not a long-term resident, not connected to any of the families that constituted the town's internal architecture of obligation and history. She had a lease and a business and a waiting list. She had realized over 5 months, had something else. She had women, not conspiratorially, not as a faction or a cause, but as clients who came to her shop and sat in the client chair and talked in the way that people talk in rooms they trust, and who were wives and mothers and sisters of men who farmed and ranched and ran businesses, and sat on committees and had opinions about things that mattered to the town. And these women had, over 5 months, come to trust Clara's judgment in the specific way that people trust someone who has demonstrated repeatedly that they keep confidences and tell the truth and do what they say they'll do. She started having conversations. Not a campaign, not anything organized enough to deserve that name. She talked to Beth Summers, whose husband Thomas was a farmer whose land was watered by the same creek basin Callaway wanted to develop above. She talked to Henderson's wife, a practical woman named Louise, who attended every council meeting and had sharp opinions about all 5 members. She talked to May, who had lived in Pine Ridge 20 years and understood its internal geography better than anyone Clara had met. "Fenwick will be the vote," May said one afternoon, the two of them working through a large spring order while the April rain came down outside. "He'll go to Callaway if the money's right. The question is whether the other 4 can hold." "Who else is uncertain?" Clara asked. "Morrison might be," May said. "He's got a ranch east of the creek. If he understands what a logging road does to the watershed, he'll vote against it. But if Foster Callaway gets to him first with numbers, who does Morrison listen to?" May thought. "His wife," she said without irony. "And Bill Hartley at the bank. Not Garland. Hartley, who manages the agricultural accounts." Clara filed this. She was careful. She was not a woman who threw her influence around without measuring the throw, and she was very conscious of her position. 5 months, no formal standing, a past that the town still referenced when it was convenient. She did not pretend she was operating from a position of authority she didn't have. She operated from the position she did have, which was a shop that people trusted and a reputation, built slowly and without drama, for being straight. She talked to Hartley, who came in to have his wife's coat altered in the 2nd week of April. She raised the watershed question in the context of land values. What happens to agricultural land values when the water quality changes? And she watched him absorb this with the attention of a man who deals in exactly those numbers. "Where did you get this information?" he said. "From someone who knows the mountains better than anyone in this town," she said. Hartley looked at her for a moment. "Mercer," he said. "The information stands regardless of where it comes from," she said. "But yes." He left with the altered coat and a thoughtful expression, and the next week she heard from May that Hartley had had a private conversation with Morrison about creek basin hydrology. What she hadn't planned for was Pitts. She was aware that Pitts had been moving in the same spaces, having his own conversations, but in the opposite direction. The information came to her in pieces, the way information always came, from Beth, from May, from Louise Henderson, assembled like a pattern from separate pieces of cloth. Pitts had been talking to Fenwick. Pitts had been at the hotel the evening Callaway and his lawyer came through town. Pitts had spoken at the informal gathering at the hotel common room, saying, and this was the part that made Clara still for a moment when she heard it, that the watershed concerns were being exaggerated by outside interests with their own agendas. Outside interests. She understood what that meant. She was the outside interest. Mercer, who had been in Pine Ridge 12 years, was also being cast as an outside interest because his work was in the mountains rather than the town, and because Calloway needed the objection to be coming from somewhere other than the community itself. She told Mercer about it that evening. He received it without visible surprise, which meant he'd either expected it or had already heard. Pitts and Calloway have done business before, he said. Hardware supply for the Calloway operation on the East Ridge. It's not a complicated relationship. He's using me to discredit the objection, Clara said. I'm new enough and arrived under circumstances unusual enough that calling me an outside interest will land with some people. It will land with some people, Mercer agreed. Not everyone. Not everyone isn't good enough if Fenwick is the swing vote, she said. He looked at her across the table. They were in her shop. He came most evenings now, which was a fact that had settled into the routine of both their lives without either of them formally acknowledging it. What are you thinking? He said. I'm thinking about the council meeting, she said. The first Monday of May. It's a public meeting, he said. Anyone can attend. I know, she said. I'm thinking about more than attending. He was quiet for a moment. Clara, he said. She looked at him. He used her name rarely, which meant when he did, it carried weight. Whatever you're considering, he said, be sure it's what you want to carry. Not for me. Not for the camp. For you. It's not for you, she said, with the particular clarity of a person who has thought something through. It's for the water. It's for the town. And yes, it's for what I've built here. That's allowed to be part of it. He held her look for a moment. Yes, he said quietly. It is. The first Monday of May arrived gray and cold, and with the kind of steady drizzle that made the unpaved streets of Pine Ridge into a navigational challenge. The council meeting was held in the largest room of the hotel, which doubled as the community's de facto civic space for anything requiring more than the council chambers could hold. By 7 in the evening, the room was full. Clara had not announced she was coming. She had not prepared anything in advance in the way of a speech, because she distrusted the kind of preparation that substituted the planned version of yourself for the real one. She wore her best dress, the dark blue wool she'd made in the first weeks in Pine Ridge, from the better bolt of Avery's stock. She came in with May on one side and Beth Summers on the other, and she took a seat near the back and she listened. Foster Calloway was at the front of the room with a lawyer named Briggs, who had come from the county seat and who had the slick, precise quality of a man paid well to make things sound simpler than they were. The proposal was presented in the way that proposals designed to obscure their own implications tend to be presented, with numbers and timelines and the language of economic development, with the bond prominently featured, with the jobs mentioned 3 times, and with the watershed not mentioned at all. Clara listened to all of it. The council members sat at their table. Garland was attentive and careful. Morrison was attentive and visibly uncertain. The other 2, a man named Percy, who ran the mill and was generally considered reliable, and a woman named Adeline Marsh, who was the newest council member, and the only one who had been publicly skeptical of the Calloway family's various interests, were listening closely. Fenwick had his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has already decided and is waiting for the formality to conclude. The public comment period opened. 3 men spoke in favor. 2 of them had business relationships with Calloway that everyone in the room knew about. The third was a rancher who lived east of the creek and had, Clara thought, simply not been given the information about the watershed. Then Pitt spoke. He stood and he said what he'd been saying privately, that the opposition to this proposal came from people who were not established members of the community, who had their own interests in the mountain access, and that Pine Ridge needed to think carefully about whose voices it was prioritizing. He did not look at Clara. He did not have to. The room shifted slightly, the way rooms shift when something pointed has been said and everyone is waiting to see where it lands. Clara stood up. She did not plan the moment. She had not decided in advance that this was when she would speak. She stood up because Pitts had just said something that was both a lie and true in the specific, infuriating way of things that use a partial truth to support a false conclusion, and she was not willing to let it sit there unchallenged. "I'd like to speak," she said. The council moderator, Percy, who was running the meeting that night, looked at her and then at the room and then back at her. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, with the slightly cautious acknowledgement of a man who is not sure what he's about to witness, but recognizes that the room is watching. "You have the floor." She walked to the front. She did not hurry. She had learned over 38 years of being looked at in ways she hadn't invited that the walk to the front of a room was information, that how you moved said something before you opened your mouth, and that she had something specific to say before she said anything. She stood at the front of the room and she looked at it. All of it. The council table, the Callaway lawyer with his papers, Fenwick with his crossed arms, Pitts in the third row, Beth and May near the back, the ranchers and shopkeepers and wives and farmhands who constituted the people this decision was actually going to affect. "Mr. Pitts is right that I arrived in Pine Ridge under unusual circumstances," she said. 5 months ago, specifically. Most of you were there. I don't have a long history here, and I don't have land. What I have is a business and a lease and a working knowledge of the contracts being run through the mountain camps, which means I have spent 5 months talking to the men who work those trails and understand that watershed better than anyone in this room. A pause. The room was attentive. "The proposal before this council does not mention water once," she said. "Mr. Briggs used the word development 11 times. He used the word jobs 3 times. The Upper Creek Basin, which feeds the water supply for this town, and the irrigation systems for 11 farms along the Eastern Valley, was not mentioned at all." She looked at Morrison directly. He looked back at her. "A logging road through the Upper Basin doesn't just take the trails," she said. "It takes the bank stability on the north side of the creek for 2 miles downstream. You'll see the effects in the water clarity in 3 years. In 5 years, the silting will start affecting irrigation yields. In 10 years..." She stopped. "In 10 years, some of you won't be farming the same land because the water won't sustain it." The room was very quiet. "I'm an outside interest," she said, and she let the words have their full weight. "Mr. Pitt said so, and he's not entirely wrong. I came from Chicago. I've been here 5 months. I have no family history in Pine Ridge and no land and no formal standing in this room beyond the right anyone has to speak at a public meeting." She paused. "What I also have is nothing to gain from this vote going one way or the other. Except that I live here now and I intend to keep living here, and I would like the water to be clean." She looked at Fenwick. "There is a bond," she said. Mr. Briggs explained the bond. "A bond is a piece of paper. The watershed is not a piece of paper. When the watershed is damaged, a bond doesn't put the bank stability back. The territorial government doesn't reverse silting. I'd encourage this council to ask Mr. Briggs, in writing, tonight, before this vote, what the enforcement mechanism looks like when the development terms are not met. Not what it says it looks like, what it actually looks like." Briggs shifted in his chair. "I'm done," Clara said. "Thank you." She walked back to her seat. The room exhaled. That was the only way to describe it. A collective letting go of breath, the sound of people who had been holding something and were now releasing it. There was more discussion. Garland asked Briggs about the enforcement mechanism, in writing as Clara had suggested, and Briggs's answer was smooth and unsatisfying, and the smoothness of it was itself an answer of a kind. Adeline Marsh asked about the watershed survey, whether an independent survey had been conducted, which it had not. Morrison asked about the irrigation downstream, a question he had clearly not been planning to ask when he sat down. Fenwick asked no questions. The vote came at 9 o'clock. Garland. No. Percy. No. Adeline Marsh. No. Morrison. After a pause that lasted long enough for the room to become genuinely uncertain. No. Fenwick. Yes. The proposal failed, 4-1. The room's response was not dramatic. It was the muted, slightly stunned response of people who had seen something they'd been unsure about go the way they'd hoped, and who were processing it against the alternative they'd been bracing for. There was some conversation, some nodding, the particular quality of a public gathering that is beginning to sort itself into smaller conversations. Callaway left quickly. Briggs gathered his papers with the professional composure of a man who loses sometimes and is good at appearing to take it graciously. Fenwick spoke to no one and left. Pitts did not look at Clara. Beth found her at the back of the room and grabbed her arm with both hands, which was the most demonstrative Beth had ever been, and said, "That was," and then stopped, because she was apparently not sure what it was. "It was a public comment at a council meeting," Clara said. "It was not just that," Beth said. May appeared on her other side. "The Morrison vote," she said quietly, in the tone of professional satisfaction. "That was yours." "That was Hartley," Clara said. "I just gave him the right question." May looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been around long enough to know the difference between false modesty and genuine attribution. "Both things can be true," she said. Clara found Mercer near the door. He was standing against the wall in the way he stood in town, present but not occupying the center of the room, the particular quality of a man who is used to being the most capable person in an outdoor environment and is somewhat less certain how to calibrate himself indoors. He looked at her as she walked toward him, and the direct look had something in it she hadn't seen there before or hadn't let herself name. "You said it wasn't for me," he said quietly when she reached him. "It wasn't," she said. "I meant that." "I know you did." He paused. That didn't make it easier to watch. She understood what he meant. He was a man who had spent 12 years being the person who stood between his men and the mountain's indifference, and watching someone else stand in a room and take the risk of speaking, not a physical risk, but the other kind, the kind that costs differently, was apparently its own particular difficulty for him. "I can take care of myself," she said. "I know," he said. "I've known that since November." Another pause. "That's not the same as not wanting to be the one standing there with you." The hotel room was emptying around them, people going out into the May drizzle in small groups, the sound of conversation receding toward the street. Clara looked at him in the clearing room. "You should know," she said carefully, because she was always careful about this particular kind of thing, "that I don't need anyone to stand there with me." "I know that," he said, "but," she said, and it took her a moment because she was not practiced at this, at the particular vulnerability of saying the next part, "That doesn't mean I don't want it." The room was almost empty now. Mercer looked at her. The direct look, unchanged by the months or the evening or any of it. The look that had been the first thing she'd noticed about him in Avery's dry goods store. The look that saw what it was looking at without the social calculation most people layered over their attention. "All right," he said, quietly, as if it were a straightforward thing, because for him it apparently was. They walked out into the May drizzle together. The street was muddy and cold, and the hotel sign was creaking in the wind, and somewhere down the block the sound of the remaining council attendees discussing the evening's events drifted in and out of the wet air. It was not a romantic scene. It was a Tuesday night in a small frontier town, and everything smelled of mud and rain and wood smoke, and there was nothing scenic about any of it. Clara thought it was one of the better moments of her 38 years. She did not say this. She walked beside him through the mud toward Main Street, and the conversation that started there was about the camp's spring season and the gear order and whether the Cartwright contact was going to need additional pieces before June, and it was entirely practical and entirely ordinary. But underneath the practical and the ordinary, something had settled. Not resolved. There was plenty still unresolved, and she was not the kind of woman who confused a good evening with a solved problem. But settled. The way a building settles when the foundation is right. Not finished, not perfect, but sound. She had stood in that room and said her piece, and the town had listened, and the vote had gone the right way, and the water was safe, and the trails were safe, and the man walking beside her through the May mud had looked at her the way she wanted to be looked at, and said all right in the tone of someone who meant it. 5 months, she thought. 840 miles in 5 months and $4.40. Whatever Gerald Pitts had intended when he'd looked her up and down on Main Street and found her wanting, she was fairly certain it wasn't this. She found that she didn't particularly care what he'd intended. The mud was deep in the corner of Main and the side street, and she stepped around the worst of it with the practiced ease of a person who had been navigating Pine Ridge's unpaved realities for 5 months. And she said goodnight to Mercer at the corner of Main Street, and she walked back to the boarding house through the drizzle, and she took careful stock of this, in the way she took stock of the things that mattered. She was something close to happy, not the uncomplicated happiness of someone whose life had gone smoothly. The other kind. The kind you earn. The morning after the council meeting, Pine Ridge had the particular quality of a place that has been through something and is taking stock of itself. Clara noticed it on her walk to the shop. The conversations that stopped when she passed were different now. Not the guarded, assessing silences of her first months, but something more like the pause of people who are recalibrating, who have a new piece of information about someone and are working it into their existing understanding. Two men outside the farrier's shop nodded to her. Louise Henderson, who she knew from the camp connections, stopped her to say simply, "Good for you last night," with the directness of a woman who doesn't spend words she doesn't mean. May was already at the work table when Clara came in, which was not unusual. May often arrived first, having the early riser's habit of people who had spent years running a household before the rest of it woke up. "How are you this morning?" May asked, without looking up from the pattern she was marking. "Fine," Clara said. She hung up her coat. "Tired." "You should be. That was a long evening." May set down her marking pencil. "Calloway's lawyer was at the hotel at 7 this morning. Checked out. Took the early stage east." "Good," Clara said. "Fenwick was in the general store at 8, May continued, and by all accounts he looked like a man who'd lost a significant amount of money without technically losing anything you could point to." A pause. "Which is probably the worst kind." Clara sat down at her own table and looked at the day's work laid out in front of her. The spring order was substantial, more than she and May could comfortably run together, and she had been thinking about whether to bring on a third person part-time, a question that was still unresolved. "And Pitts?" she said. May was quiet for a moment. "Didn't see him," she said. "His store was closed this morning, which it is sometimes on Tuesdays, so that may be nothing." Clara nodded and picked up her work. They sewed in the companionable quiet that their months together had produced. A working silence that was its own kind of conversation, the kind that two people who respect each other's concentration develop without negotiating it. The rain that had fallen the night before had cleared, and the east windows were full of genuine spring light for the first time, the kind of light that made the colors of fabric accurate instead of approximate. She thought about what she'd said in that room, not with the second-guessing anxiety of someone who wasn't sure they'd done the right thing, but with the honest accounting she tried to apply to significant actions. Had she said what was true? Yes. Had she said it without malice? Mostly. She was honest enough to admit that some small part of it had been aimed directly at Gerald Pitts and his phrase outside interests, and that this had given her a satisfaction she wasn't entirely proud of, but wasn't going to pretend wasn't there. Had it been effective? The vote suggested yes, though she was careful not to overestimate her own contribution. Garland had been a no before she stood up. Adeline Marsh had been a no before she stood up. Her words had mattered for exactly one vote. Morrison's, and even that had been a matter of giving an already uncertain man a specific question to ask, rather than changing a settled mind. One vote was enough. One vote had been the vote. She thought about her mother, who had told her once that the most important thing a woman could do in any room was say the true thing when the true thing was inconvenient. Clara had been maybe 15 when this was said to her, and she had not fully understood it then. It had seemed like advice designed for a more dramatic life than the one she expected to have. A life of workrooms and measuring tapes and the quiet satisfaction of a seam that lay flat. She understood it now. You didn't get to choose when the true thing was inconvenient. You only got to choose whether you said it. Mercer came to the shop that afternoon. This was itself unremarkable. He came most afternoons, and had for months, and the town had long since adjusted its commentary about this from speculation to simple acknowledgement. What was different was that he came in and he did not take off his hat and set it on the corner of the work table in the usual way. He stood in the doorway for a moment and he looked at her with the direct look, and then he said, "Can you leave the shop for an hour?" Clara looked at May. "Go," May said, without looking up. They walked to the north end of town, past the last of the buildings and out onto the road that led toward the mountains, the road she had ridden with him in November, and in the gray winter weeks, and in the early spring. They walked without talking for a few minutes, the town falling behind them, and the open land opening up, and the mountains white and enormous ahead. He stopped at a flat boulder beside the road that she had noticed before. It was the kind of landmark a landscape offers, a place that feels like it has been designated for pause. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at the mountains for a moment. She had noticed this about him, that when he was about to say something that cost him something, he looked at the mountains first, as if checking that they were still there, that the fixed points were fixed. "Last night," he said, "watching you stand up in that room." He stopped, started again, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who started sentences twice. "I've watched people be brave in the mountains, physical brave, the kind where there's a specific thing trying to kill you, and you do the necessary thing anyway. I understand that kind. I know what it takes." He paused. "What you did last night was different," he said. "You stood up in a room full of people who have spent 5 months deciding what they think about you, and you said something that was going to be unpopular with some of them, no matter how it went, and you said it because it was true, and because someone needed to say it." He looked at her then. "I don't know that I could have done that. Stood in a room and made myself that available to people's judgment." Clara considered this. "You go back into the mountains after avalanches," she said. "That's different," he said. "The mountain doesn't have an opinion about me." She looked at him for a moment, at the straight lines of his face and the gray at his temples and the old weathered quality of him that was not age exactly, but was the residue of sustained commitment to hard things. She thought about November, when he had been a stranger who looked at her plainly in a dry goods store. She thought about February, when she had stood outside the doctor's house in the cold and understood that she cared very specifically whether he was going to be all right. She thought about all the afternoons at the work table and the evenings with the tea going cold, and the conversations that had moved, gradually and without announcement, from business to something else. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right. The thing you said last night, about wanting to be the one standing there with me." She met his eyes. "Did you mean that in the general way or in the specific way?" A pause. "The specific way," he said. "I've meant it in the specific way for a while now. I wasn't sure you'd want—" He stopped. "You're very self-sufficient, Clara. That's not a complaint. It just makes it harder to know where the line is between what you want and what you've decided to do without because it's simpler." She thought about this carefully because it deserved care. He was right, and it was a precise observation, and she had the honesty to sit with it for a moment rather than deflecting it. "That's fair," she said. "I've been doing things alone for a long time. It's a habit." "I know," he said, "and I don't want someone to stand there with me because I can't stand there myself," she said. "That's not what I'm after." "I know that too," he said. "That's not what I'm offering." She looked at him. "What are you offering?" He turned his hat in his hands. The gesture she knew meant he was working through something that didn't have a neat shape. "I'm offering the specific way," he said, "which means I'm not interested in making your decisions or fixing your problems or being the person you report to. I'm interested in being the person who's there, who knows what's happening and gives a damn how it goes." The road was quiet around them. The mountains were doing what mountains do, which is exist without any particular concern for the human business at their feet. But they were there, and large, and in the afternoon light they were less threatening than they were simply present, the way old things are present. "I give a damn how it goes for you too," Clara said. "In the specific way. I have for a while." He looked at her. "Since roughly February," she added, with the particular precision of someone who believes in being accurate. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, because he was not a dramatic man, but the way a thing shifts when a weight that has been uncertain finds its place. "February," he said, "when I was laid up with broken ribs and couldn't do anything useful." "You dictated excellent letters," she said. He laughed then. A real laugh. Not the precursor to a laugh, but the thing itself. And she had heard it rarely enough that it was its own kind of gift. They walked back to town in the afternoon light, and the conversation that filled the walk was easy and ordinary and covered the spring camp schedule and the Cartwright contract, and whether May would be willing to take on the third person Clara was considering, and all of it was practical, and all of it was also, underneath, the first conversation of a different arrangement between them, the kind that didn't need to be named to be real. The weeks that followed were not, in the way of real life, a smooth progression toward resolution. There were difficult days. The camp went back into the mountains in the second week of May, and she watched it go from the north end of town with a quality of attention she recognized as worry. And worry was not something she had previously applied to Mercer's departures because she had not previously had the standing to worry. She did not like worrying. She did not find it useful. She did it anyway. The business had a difficult week in late May when a large order was delayed because Avery's supplier had sent the wrong weight of wool, and she and May spent 3 days in tense renegotiation with the supplier and one genuinely bad afternoon where it seemed like the order might have to be canceled entirely. It did not get canceled, but the 3 days were 3 days of sustained stress that she absorbed into her body in the specific way she'd always absorbed it, through the shoulders, through the jaw, through the particular quality of sleep that was technically rest but did not fully restore. She was not, she understood by now, a person without rough edges. She was impatient sometimes. She was too quick to assume she was right, and occasionally she was wrong in ways that cost her. She had misread a client's needs once and produced a garment that required significant rework, which she had acknowledged without excessive self-flagellation and corrected without drama, but which had bothered her more than it should have. She was sometimes lonely in a way that her self-sufficiency didn't fully address. The specific loneliness of a person who has the practical mechanisms of life well in hand and still comes home at night to a boarding house room. Mercer came back from the spring camp in June. He came back with all his men, which by now Clara understood was not a given and was the metric by which he measured his own success. Jack Russell came back with the look of someone who had found out what he was made of and was still processing the information. Mitchell, with the red beard, had a long cut on his forearm that had healed to a scar. Henderson shook Clara's hand when he saw her in town, which was new, and said, "Good gear again, Miss Hawthorne," which was its own form of highest praise. The evening Mercer came back. He came to the shop after everyone had been accounted for, and the camp had stood down, and he had done the paperwork that a camp leader does at the end of a season. He came in and he put his hat on the corner of the work table, and he sat in the client chair, and she brought tea, and they talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. At the end of it, he said, "I'd like to not be in separate buildings." Clara looked at him over her teacup. "I'm at the boarding house," she said. "You're at the hotel." "That's the current arrangement," he said. "I'm suggesting a different one." She set down her cup. She thought about the narrow room at Mrs. Halliday's with its single window and the bed that was clean if not comfortable. She thought about 8 months of building something from nothing and what the something had become and what she wanted the next part to look like. "You're suggesting we get married," she said, because she preferred directness to circumlocution, and she was fairly sure that was what he was suggesting. "I am," he said, "if you want to." "Not as a practical arrangement," she said. "I can manage practical arrangements on my own." "I know," he said, "not as a practical arrangement, as the specific way." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about Gerald Pitts on Main Street in October, and the word inconvenience and the 30 yards of mud she had walked back across, with the feeling of the world having narrowed to a single brutal point. She thought about how she had taken that moment and what she had built out of it, not because Pitts deserved to be proven wrong. He did, but that wasn't the reason. But because she was who she was, and who she was did not leave without trying. She thought about what her mother had told her about the true thing in the inconvenient room. She thought about the things she had understood since February and had been careful about and had carried quietly until careful was no longer necessary. "Yes," she said, "I want to." They were married in late June. It was not a large ceremony. Clara had not wanted a large ceremony. She had specific and well-reasoned objections to the way weddings in her experience tended to become performances of other people's expectations rather than the actual event they were supposed to be. And Mercer had no objections to a small wedding because Mercer had no objections to anything that Clara had thought through carefully and decided on. They were married by the Justice of the Peace in the room attached to the council chambers on a Thursday morning, with May Sutton and Tom as witnesses, and Beth Summers present because Clara had known she would be devastated to be excluded and had found she didn't want to exclude her. Clara wore the dark blue dress she'd made in her first weeks in Pine Ridge, the one she'd worn to the council meeting, because it was the best dress she owned and because it had been with her through things that mattered, and she saw no reason to replace it with something new for the occasion. Mercer wore a clean shirt and his good coat, and he was, she thought, as close to nervous as she had ever seen him. A very slight quality of care in how he stood, the hat-turning gesture briefly evident before he put his hat down and left it down. The ceremony was short and to the point, which was how both of them preferred things. When it was over, May hugged her with the restrained but genuine warmth of a woman who had watched the whole of it and was quietly pleased with how it had gone. And Beth Summers cried in the uncomplicated way of someone who cries at weddings because they are happy and has no embarrassment about this. And Tom shook Mercer's hand and said something low that made Mercer's mouth do the thing that was close to a smile. The town found out in the way towns find things out, and the response was, Clara took careful stock of this as she did with significant things, largely warm, not universally. There were people who would always see her as the woman from Chicago who'd arrived under peculiar circumstances, and she had made her peace with this because you could not build a life in a place and simultaneously require every person in it to revise their opinion, and she had stopped needing them to. But largely warm. Louise Henderson brought food to the boarding house, which was the frontier tradition for marking significant events, and Howard Garland stopped her on the street to say, "Congratulations, Miss Hawthorne," and then corrected himself with a slightly flustered air, and she told him she was keeping the name professionally, which she was, which seemed to ease his discomfort. Gerald Pitts said nothing to her. He nodded once on the street 2 days after the ceremony, a small, tight nod that she returned with the same economy, and that was the entirety of it. She did not require more from him, and she did not offer more. What he had done in October had shaped the course of her life in ways she could not have predicted, and she was not grateful for it. She did not believe in the convenient narrative that suffering is a gift, but she had used it. She had taken the worst moment she'd experienced in years, and she had built from it, stubbornly and without a great deal of grace, and at significant personal cost, something that was better than what she'd had before. She was not going to pretend that didn't count. By July, the shop had outgrown itself. This was a good problem, which she understood as such and was careful not to complain about, but it was a real problem that required a real solution. She and May had taken on a third seamstress, a young woman named Carla, who was 19 and quick, and who needed teaching and precision but had the instincts for the work. The three of them were running the space to its limit, and the winter gear orders for the coming season were already stacking up. Clara went to see Howard Garland. He looked at her across his desk with the expression she'd come to know well. The multiple calculations expression. The expression of a man doing the arithmetic of a situation. "I need the front room," she said, "not just the back." Garland blinked. "That's Pitts's lease on the storefront is month to month," she said. "I asked about the terms last month. He's been on month to month since his 5-year term ended in February." She paused. "I'm offering a 2-year term at $4 a month for the combined space." A silence. "You've thought this through," Garland said. "I think things through," Clara said. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. She left with a 2-year lease on the full building, both the back room she'd been operating in and the storefront that had been Pitts's, at a price that was fair to Garland and workable for her. Pitts moved his hardware business to the smaller building 2 doors down, which had previously housed a boot repair shop. The move appeared to take most of a day and required Tom's assistance, which Mercer had apparently offered without being asked, and which Clara did not comment on either way. She moved the shop into the front room on a Saturday in August. The east windows were still the best light, but the front windows faced south and caught the afternoon in a way that was beautiful and also useful, and the space was large enough now that the three of them could work without the constant spatial negotiation that the back room had required. She arranged the tools on the expanded work table. She moved the client chair to a better position. She put a small sign in the window, better than the original one, painted rather than hand-lettered, reading, "Hawthorne's Sewing, Clara Hawthorne, proprietor, custom work, alterations, mountain gear." She stood in the doorway of the new shop on that Saturday afternoon in August, and she looked at it. May came to stand beside her. "Good," May said. "Yes," Clara said. It was not, she thought, the life she had planned. She had planned to marry a hardware man she'd written letters to for 7 months, and to settle into something comfortable and known. That plan had failed on a Tuesday morning in October in the most public way possible, and she had been left with nothing but a trunk and a sewing kit and a choice between leaving and staying. She had stayed. Not because staying was easy. It had not been easy. It had been one of the most sustained difficult things she had done in 38 years of doing difficult things. Not because she had known it would work out. She had not known this. And anyone who told a story like this and claimed they'd always known it would work out was either lying or misremembering. She had stayed because leaving meant agreeing with the person who had told her she wasn't enough, And she had never believed that. Not really. Not underneath the humiliation. There's a kind of person who gets knocked down and gets back up and everyone calls it brave, and maybe it is. But Clara had never thought of herself as brave in that way. She thought of herself as stubborn, which is something else. Less noble, more durable. Stubbornness doesn't require courage. It only requires the refusal to let someone else's assessment of you become the one you operate by. She had been stubborn. She had been competent. She had been, in the end, simply unwilling to be the person Gerald Pitts had decided she was. That was all. That was the whole of it. Mercer found her that evening on the front step of the shop after May and Carla had gone home and the street was quiet in the early August dusk. He came and sat beside her on the step, which was not built for two people but managed, and he looked at the street with her. "How does it feel?" he said. She thought about this honestly, as she thought about everything. "Like it's mine," she said. He nodded, as if this was the exact right answer, which it was. The mountains were visible at the end of the street, the way they had been visible on every day of the past 10 months, in the white of November, in the gray compression of winter, in the tentative green of spring, and now in the deep warm blue of a summer evening. They had not changed. They were exactly what they had always been, enormous and permanent, and entirely indifferent to the business of the people at their feet. She had come to find this not frightening but clarifying. The mountains didn't care. The mountains didn't keep score. The mountains were simply there, the fixed points around which everything else moved, and there was something in that solidity that she had, over 10 months, come to rely on in a way she hadn't expected. She had come to Pine Ridge to marry a stranger and build a life she'd imagined from a distance. She had built a life instead from the ground up, in the cold, in the mud, in the public difficulty of it, and the life she'd built was not the one she'd imagined. It was more specific than the one she'd imagined, more hard-won, more real. She had a shop with her name on the window. She had a partner who looked at her without agenda and was there in the specific way. She had May, who was steady and skilled and had become, quietly and without announcement, a genuine friend. She had Beth, who cried at weddings and brought information and meant well, in the transparent, guileless way of someone who has never learned to be strategic about caring. She had Jack Russell, who would come by the shop sometimes just to say hello, and Henderson, and a waiting list, and a lease, and a clear water supply in the creek basin north of town. She had a place. Not the place she'd been promised, or the place she'd planned for, or the place that anyone looking at her on that Tuesday in October would have predicted she'd end up. Her own place. Built by her hands, on her terms, out of the specific combination of stubbornness and competence and the refusal to disappear that had been, it turned out, exactly what the situation required. The dusk deepened. The street was quiet. The mountains went from blue to purple to the particular dark that came before stars. Clara sat on the step of her shop with her husband beside her, and she thought, this is what it looks like when you don't leave. Not perfect. Not easy. Not the version where everything works out because the right person deserves it to. The version where everything works out because you stayed when you could have gone, and you built when you could have waited, and you stood up when you could have been quiet, and at the end of it, the thing you built was solid enough to stand in. That was the version. That was all there was, and it was enough, and it was hers.